Hello everyone, I'm here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Lena had never thought she'd come back to Elder Grove, not after everything that happened. After she left for college and then moved to the city, it felt like the town was a part of her past she'd buried, along with her childhood, her family, and the memories that clung to the small, quiet town like a thick fog. Elder Grove had always been a place where nothing much happened, where the same faces smiled at you every day, and the weight of everyone's secrets lingered in the air like an unspoken word. But now, after nearly a decade, she found herself driving down the winding roads leading into town. The thick trees on either side of the road were just as she remembered them, their gnarled branches reaching overhead, blocking out the sun as they formed a canopy of dark green. The smell of pine and earth filled the air, and the small houses with their picket fences passed by in a blur of familiarity. Elder Grove was unchanged, and yet everything felt foreign. Her old friends, Jacob, Amelia, and Elliot, had convinced her to come back for a weekend getaway at the cabin by Silent Lake. It had been their favorite spot during their teenage years. They had spent so many weekends there, sneaking out at night to sit by the water, daring each other to dip their toes into the still, dark surface. Lena had agreed, mostly because she thought it might be a way to close the door on her past. The town, her friends, her parents, everything, it had all been too much to carry, and she had left it behind. But this invitation, it felt like a summons, and the closer she got to the lake, the more she questioned her decision to come back. As she passed the familiar road signs leading toward the cabin, an uneasy feeling started to gnaw at her. There was something wrong in the air, something she couldn't quite place. A subtle sense of foreboding hung over the town like a cloud, and the silence that enveloped it felt heavier than she remembered. She shook the thought from her mind and pulled into the small gravel driveway of the cabin. The rickety wood frame house sat nestled between the trees, its porch lights flickering against the fading dusk. The air was growing colder, and the lake beyond it seemed to shimmer in the dying light of the evening, as though it was waiting for her. Lena stepped out of her car, locking the door behind her, and pulled her jacket tightly around her shoulders. The scent of pine and damp earth mixed with something else, the faintest trace of decay in the air. "Hey, you're here," Jacob called from the porch, his lanky frame silhouetted against the light. He waved, a grin spreading across his face. Lena's stomach tightened. She hadn't seen Jacob in years, but he hadn't changed much. He was still the same freckled, easygoing guy she remembered. His grin faded slightly as he caught sight of her expression. "You okay?" he asked, his voice softening. Lena nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, it's been a while." As she walked up the porch steps, Amelia and Elliot appeared from inside the cabin. Amelia's sharp eyes caught hers instantly, and for a brief moment, Lena felt a flash of guilt. Amelia had always been the closest to her, the one person who could read her thoughts without a word. It was one of the reasons Lena had pulled away from everyone when she left. She didn't want anyone to see how broken she was, how hollow she felt. But there was no hiding from Amelia. "You made it," Amelia said, her voice a little too bright. She stepped forward and hugged Lena tightly, holding on for a moment longer than necessary. Elliot, the quieter of the group, offered her a small smile. "Good to see you again, Lena." Lena nodded, offering her own smile as she stepped inside the cabin. It hadn't changed much either, just as she remembered. The same old furniture, the same worn rug on the floor, and the faint smell of wood smoke and stale air lingering in the corners. "Welcome to the Silent Lake Retreat," Jacob said with a dramatic flourish. "Amelia has already stocked up on snacks and drinks, so we're all set for a good weekend." Lena chuckled, though it felt forced. "Sounds perfect." The evening passed with the four of them catching up. They ate dinner, joked, and shared memories of their teenage years. The lake was always a part of their conversations, its eerily quiet surface, its reputation as a place of legend and mystery. But the whispers, they didn't talk about those. The whispers of the lake, The strange voices that were said to call to you at night. The ones that would make you do things you couldn't explain. Lena wasn't sure if those were just stories or if they were real, but there had always been something about the lake that unsettled her. As a child, she had never liked being near it. She had heard the whispers, the soft, beckoning call that seemed to rise from the depths when the moon was full. "Let's go for a walk," Jacob suggested after dinner. "It's clear out tonight. We can head down to the lake." Lena hesitated. She didn't want to admit that she was unnerved by the lake, by its stillness and the strange things that had always happened there. But she didn't want to appear scared either. She forced a smile. "Sure, let's go." The four of them walked down the overgrown path leading to the lake. The woods closed in around them as they neared the water, the trees casting long shadows in the moonlight. The lake lay ahead, a dark, glassy surface that seemed to stretch out forever. It was silent, unnervingly so. Lena felt a chill crawl up her spine as she stared out at it, the calm waters mocking her unease. For a brief moment, she swore she heard something, like a whisper on the end, faint but unmistakable. It was as though the lake was calling to her. "You okay?" Amelia asked quietly, her voice almost drowned out by the stillness. Lena turned, giving a nervous laugh. "Yeah, I don't know. Something about the lake always gives me the creeps." Amelia gave her a soft smile. "You always were the superstitious one." But the whisper didn't stop. It grew louder, more distinct, calling out to her. A voice, no, voices, seemed to rise from the depths, rising above the night's quiet. The others noticed it too, their eyes widening as the soft murmur filled the air. I think we should go back," Lena said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Her pulse quickened, and her breath became shallow as the whisper seemed to take on a more insistent tone. But it wasn't just the whisper that unsettled her. It was the feeling that the lake was waiting for something. For her. And in that moment, Lena knew whatever lay beneath the surface of Silent Lake had always been there. Watching, waiting, and now it was calling her. The whisper had faded, but the unease lingered in the air like a heavy fog. Lena stood at the edge of the water, her feet rooted to the cold ground beneath her, as though the earth itself was trying to hold her in place. Her breath was shallow, the air thick and still, as if time itself had frozen in that moment. "Lena," Jacob's voice broke through the silence, a gentle nudge that seemed to pull her from the trance she'd fallen into. His voice wasn't filled with concern, more like he hadn't quite understood what she was feeling. "You're not seriously spooked by the lake, are you?" Lena blinked, shaking her head slightly as if waking from a dream. She forced herself to smile, but it was a weak attempt. "No, I'm fine. I thought I heard something. It's probably nothing." Amelia stepped closer to Lena, her expression soft with sympathy. She knew Lena well enough to sense that something was wrong. Her brow furrowed as she glanced out over the water, the moonlight shimmering off the still surface like glass. "It's been years since any of us were out here at night," Amelia said quietly. "We used to joke about the lake being weird, but it's just that, stories." Lena nodded, but the nagging feeling wouldn't go away. The whispers hadn't just been a figment of her imagination. Something had been there, just beneath the surface, calling out to her in a way that didn't feel like a simple wind. It felt personal, and the fear it had stirred within her was not something she could easily dismiss. Elliot, standing a few paces behind, finally spoke. "Let's head back. No reason to stick around when the air is getting so thick." Lena agreed without hesitation. "Yeah, I think that's a good idea." The group turned and walked back along the overgrown trail toward the cabin, the comforting crunch of gravel beneath their shoes filling the silence. Lena kept glancing back over her shoulder toward the lake, feeling an odd pull, as if the water itself was trying to reach out and drag her back into its depths. Back at the cabin, the fire crackled in the hearth, its warm glow a stark contrast to the chill that had settled over Lena's skin. She and the others gathered around the fire, the tension in the room palpable as everyone tried to act normal, as if the unsettling encounter by the lake hadn't happened at all. "So, Lena," Jacob said, breaking the silence with his usual easy tone. "You've got to tell us how life's been in the big city. You're always so busy now that you're out there, huh?" Lena smiled faintly and shrugged, her thoughts still distant. "It's been fine. Busy like you said. The city never really stops. But it's different, you know? There's always something happening." Amelia looked at her with a quiet understanding, sensing that Lena wasn't quite there, her mind still on something else. It must be a lot to adjust to, leaving Elder Grove behind. Lena swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her past settling on her chest. She'd run from Elder Grove. She had run from everything, the lake, her childhood, the memories that had clung to her like a second skin. She'd run to escape the unease that had always lingered in her mind, but now she was back, standing at the threshold of something she couldn't ignore. "I guess I just wanted to forget," Lena said quietly, almost to herself. She stared into the fire, watching the flames dance and flicker as though they were trying to tell her something. "What do you mean forget?" Jacob asked, his tone light but his gaze searching. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "I don't know. There are things from back then. Things I just didn't want to deal with. The lake, the stories, She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. The memories were so heavy, so full of things she hadn't allowed herself to think about for years. I didn't want to deal with any of it, so I left. There was a long pause. The fire crackled and popped, filling the silence. Finally, Amelia spoke again, her voice soft but persistent. "Lena, whatever it is, you know we're your friends. You can talk to us. You don't have to carry it alone." Lena's chest tightened, and for a moment, she was back in the past, back in the cabin when they were kids, telling each other stories about the lake and the strange things that had happened there. The old woman who had drowned herself, the strange noises in the woods, the way the moon had always seemed to shine brighter over Silent Lake. But there had been other things too, things she had never told anyone, things that, deep down, she was terrified would surface again. Before Lena could respond, the house shook slightly, the walls groaning with the force of something heavy. The fire flickered and dimmed for a moment, casting eerie shadows across the room. "What was that?" Elliot asked, standing up abruptly, his chair scraping across the wooden floor. Lena's heart skipped a beat. The feeling she'd been trying to suppress since arriving here now surged forward. She didn't need to say it out loud. They all felt it. The sound of footsteps outside, slow and deliberate, began to make its way toward the cabin. Heavy, as though someone was walking in the mud, leaving footprints that would leave impressions behind in their wake. "Who's out there?" Jacob's voice was tinged with suspicion. Lena stood frozen, unable to look away from the door. It was as if she could feel it, whatever it was on the other side, waiting for her. The footsteps stopped. A silence followed that stretched for what felt like hours. Just when Lena thought she might explode from the tension, there came a soft knock at the door. Lena's breath caught in her throat. The knock was so deliberate, so calculated, that it felt like a warning, a challenge. "Who's there?" Jacob's voice was cautious now, the bravado from earlier gone. No response, only the deafening silence. Suddenly, the door creaked open on its own. A chill swept through the cabin as the door slowly opened, revealing nothing but the darkness of the night. "Shut the door," Elliot shouted, rushing forward to slam it shut. But as he reached the door, the unmistakable sound of someone or something laughing faintly in the distance filled the air. It wasn't a friendly laugh. It was a low, hollow sound, distant but unmistakable. Lena's blood ran cold. It had begun. The lake was no longer just a story. It was real, and it was calling them. The door slammed shut, its sudden motion breaking the eerie silence that had engulfed the room. Elliot stood there, panting slightly, his hands still gripping the wooden frame as if to keep the dark forces on the other side at bay. The fire crackled violently, casting erratic shadows that danced across the room in a frantic rhythm. "What the hell was that?" Jacob asked, his voice sharp with confusion and fear. Lena didn't speak. She couldn't. Her mind was racing. The footsteps, the knock, and now that laugh. the faint, hollow sound that seemed to echo in her bones. It wasn't human, not in any way she recognized. It was something deeper, something ancient. Amelia stepped forward, her face pale in the dim light. "Lena, is this the same feeling you had as a kid?" Lena's throat tightened and she nodded slowly, unable to keep her eyes from darting to the door. It felt like something was watching them, waiting for the moment they would slip, revealing whatever dark secret was lurking just beneath the surface. "Maybe we should leave," Elliot suggested, his voice wavering slightly. "This doesn't feel right." "No." Lena's voice was firm, though her heart was pounding in her chest. "We can't just run from this. Whatever it is, it's tied to the lake. We came here for a reason, and I think it's time we figure out what that reason is." Jacob gave her a look, but there was an understanding in his eyes. He'd always trusted her instincts, even when those instincts had been more about survival than logic. "All right," Jacob said, clapping his hands together. "Then let's get to it. We go down to the lake, find out what the hell is going on, and we deal with it." Elliot looked uncertain. "You're really serious about this? After all that happened?" Lena met his gaze with steady eyes. "We've come this far. We need answers." After a moment's hesitation, Elliot sighed and nodded. "Fine, let's go then." The night had grown colder as they walked through the woods towards Silent Lake. The trees loomed overhead, their bare branches twisting like skeletal arms reaching for the sky. The moon hung low, casting a faint, ghostly light over the path, but the forest felt alive in a way it hadn't before, almost as if the earth itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Lena led the way, her heart hammering in her chest, the whispers of the lake growing louder in her mind. She could feel the pull, the invisible tether that seemed to guide her, compelling her toward the water. But it wasn't a comforting sensation. It was a command, a beckoning, a warning. As they reached the edge of the lake, the water sat still and calm under the moonlight, reflecting the stars above like a perfect mirror. The silence was unnerving. No ripples, no breeze, just the oppressive stillness. The lake felt like a secret, something hidden beneath its surface, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. "Where's the sound?" Amelia whispered, her eyes scanning the dark waters. "It's always been different at night. The wind in the trees, the creatures, the life. But now, it's like it's dead." Lena didn't answer at first. She stood there, staring at the water, her hands trembling as the feeling of being watched intensified. Every instinct inside her screamed that something wasn't right, that they shouldn't be here. And yet, she couldn't bring herself to leave. "I need to go closer," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her legs moved forward before she could stop herself, carrying her to the edge of the water. The others hesitated behind her, unsure but unwilling to let her face whatever this was alone. "Lena," Jacob said cautiously, but Lena didn't stop. She felt drawn to the edge, as though something invisible was pulling her, urging her to look. The water was eerily quiet, too quiet. Suddenly, the surface rippled just slightly at first, barely noticeable. Lena froze. The ripples expanded, moving in circles, as though something was rising from beneath. The air thickened, the pressure around them increasing, making it hard to breathe. Amelia stepped closer, her voice barely audible. "What's happening?" "I don't know," Lena whispered back, her gaze locked on the water. The ripples grew stronger, more pronounced, and the surface seemed to churn as though something enormous was shifting beneath it. Then, without warning, a shape began to emerge. It was large, too large to be anything natural, and as it surfaced, Lena felt her blood run cold. It was like an arm, a massive, twisted, fleshy limb that moved with unnatural grace. The surface of the water began to froth and bubble, and for a moment, Lena thought she saw eyes, deep, black eyes, staring back at her. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything human. Lena took a step back, her heart racing. What the hell is that? Before anyone could answer, the arm moved with terrifying speed. Rising out of the water, and slamming against the shore with a deafening crash. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and the lake's surface rippled violently, as though it were alive and hungry. Jacob pulled Lena back, his face pale. "We need to get out of here. Now!" But it was too late. A loud, guttural roar shook the air, and from the depths of the lake, something else emerged. Something huge, dark, and impossibly ancient. The moonlight gleamed off its wet, slimy surface, revealing jagged, spiny features and enormous, writhing tendrils that stretched out like monstrous limbs. The lake was no longer just a body of water. It was a living thing, and it was alive with rage. And it was coming for them. The creature's form was massive, like a nightmare pulled from the depths of some forgotten abyss. Its body glistened in the moonlight, slick and oily, covered in patches of wet, blackened scales. The tendrils that had risen from the lake were thick and writhing, twisting in the air as if they had a mind of their own, reaching out like hungry serpents searching for their prey. Lena stumbled backward, her heart racing. Fear gripped her chest, a vice that squeezed tighter with every passing second. The ground beneath her seemed to vibrate as the creature's massive body continued to surface, displacing the water with an unnatural force. Its eyes, deep, empty, and black, locked onto her, as though it could see into her very soul. "Get back!" Jacob shouted, pulling her further away from the water's edge. Amelia and Elliot scrambled to move, their feet slipping on the wet earth, but it was too late. The creature let out a roar, a deafening, guttural sound that sent shockwaves through the forest, shaking the trees and causing the ground to tremble beneath them. The roar seemed to reverberate in Lena's bones, a sound so ancient and primal that it felt like the earth itself was howling in pain. "Run!" Lena screamed, but her voice was drowned out by the deafening noise. Elliot was the first to break into a sprint, his legs pumping as he bolted toward the safety of the woods. Jacob followed close behind, dragging Lena with him, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from the lake. The creature's massive form was almost fully out of the water now, its tendrils thrashing wildly, creating ripples that sent waves crashing against the shore. For a split second, Lena thought she saw something else, a shadow in the water, a figure standing beneath the surface, watching them. It looked human, but distorted, like a ghostly reflection of something long lost. "Lena, move!" Jacob shouted again, his hand gripping her arm tightly, pulling her toward the trees. Lena snapped out of her daze and began running, her feet pounding the earth as they made their way back into the woods. The path they had taken earlier was now nothing more than a blur, the trees rushing past in a chaotic smear of branches and leaves. The sounds of the creature's movements echoed behind them, the crashing of waves, the splintering of wood as its tendrils whipped through the trees. "We can't outrun him," Elliot yelled from ahead, his voice full of panic. "It's too fast. We have to find shelter," Jacob shouted back, his voice strained. "There's a cabin nearby. If we can get there, we might have a chance." Lena's legs burned with the effort, but she kept moving, pushing herself to keep up. The sound of the creature's pursuit grew louder, closer. She could feel it, as though it was right on top of them, the weight of its presence pressing down on her, suffocating her with fear. They reached the edge of the woods, where the cabin stood, a small, weathered building that seemed to offer nothing more than the illusion of safety. The door was open, and Lena barely hesitated before darting inside, her breath coming in ragged gasps. They all piled inside, slamming the door shut behind them. Jacob quickly locked it, his eyes wide with fear as he turned to face the others. "It's here," Lena whispered, her voice barely audible as she pressed her back against the door. The sound of the creature's roars echoed through the trees, but now it was muffled, as though the walls of the cabin were holding it at bay. "What the hell is that thing?" Elliot gasped, his chest heaving. He was covered in mud, his clothes torn from running through the underbrush, but his eyes were wide, frantic. How could something like that exist? It's impossible. Lena shook her head, unable to answer him. The truth was too horrifying to put into words. She had always known that something was wrong with the lake, but she had never imagined it could be this, something alive, something ancient, something that had been waiting for years, centuries to awaken. "We need to figure out what we're dealing with," Amelia said, her voice steady despite the fear that was etched across her face. "There has to be a reason for this, a reason why it's after us." Lena nodded, her mind racing. The lake, the whispers, the shadows in the water, it all made sense now. This was no accident. The creature wasn't just hunting them. It was calling to them. "It's tied to me," Lena said quietly, her voice trembling. We should never have come back." Jacob turned to her, his eyes narrowing. "What do you mean?" Lena swallowed hard, her throat dry as she fought to speak. "The lake. It's been watching me for years. When I was a kid, I used to see things, hear things. I never told anyone because I thought it was just my imagination. But now I know. It's real. I don't know what it wants, but it's been waiting for me." There was a long silence as the weight of her words settled in. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows against the walls. Outside, the wind had picked up, howling through the trees like a chorus of tortured souls. Amelia was the first to speak. "So, what now? We just sit here and wait for it to come for us?" "No," Lena said firmly. "We can't just hide. We need to find out what it is, why it's here, and what it wants. And we need to do it before it finds us." Elliot shook his head. "And how do you propose we do that? We're dealing with something that shouldn't exist. What kind of knowledge do we have to stop it?" Lena glanced at the fire, the flickering flames casting dancing shadows across her face. "There's a legend about the lake. My grandmother used to tell me stories when I was young about a beast that dwells beneath its waters. It was said to be the guardian of something ancient, something powerful, and it only awakens when blood is spilled on the water." Lena's blood ran cold as the pieces began to fall into place. Blood. That's why it had come for them. They had disturbed the lake. They had awakened it. But how could they stop it now? The wind howled again, and the door shuddered as something outside rattled it with a force that sent chills down Lena's spine. She turned to the others, her eyes filled with a new determination. "We don't have much time," she said. "We need to find the answers, and we need to do it fast." The wind howled outside, rattling the cabin's walls with an eerie persistence. Lena sat by the fire, the dim glow casting long shadows across her face. Her thoughts were racing, her mind grasping for anything, any clue that could help them understand what they were dealing with. Jacob paced the room, his brow furrowed. "You're telling us there's a legend about this creature, and you've known about it all this time?" His voice had a sharp edge to it, a mix of disbelief and frustration. "Why didn't you say anything sooner?" Lena flinched, guilt twisting in her chest. "I didn't think it was real," she admitted softly. "When I was a child, it all felt like stories, ghost stories, fairy tales. But now I know the truth, and the truth is worse than anything I imagined." Elliot glanced at the door, his eyes scanning the dark shadows that surrounded them. "We're stuck here. The creature's out there, and we have no idea what it wants, what it can do. Sitting in here, trying to make sense of it, isn't going to get us anywhere." "We don't have a choice," Lena replied, her voice steady. "We need to understand why it's after us, why it's after me." She glanced at the others. Jacob's face was grim, and Amelia was staring at the fire, her hands tightly gripping the edge of the table. Lena felt the weight of their gaze, the pressure of their expectation, but she couldn't falter now. They were in this together. "I've heard the stories all my life," Lena continued, "but they never made sense. My grandmother used to talk about the lake, the curse, the guardian. She would tell me that the lake had a power, something older than time itself. It was said to protect an ancient secret, a treasure hidden beneath the waters." Elliot raised an eyebrow. "A treasure? You think that's what it wants?" Lena shook her head. "Not exactly. I don't think it's after treasure. The treasure, it's a symbol. My grandmother always said that the creature was connected to something older, something dark. The lake doesn't just hold a secret, it guards it. And when the balance is disturbed, when someone tries to take that secret, the creature awakens. Balance? What kind of balance? Jacob asked. Lena hesitated. She had never fully understood what her grandmother meant by that, but it was becoming clearer now. I don't know. I remember something about a blood sacrifice. A blood sacrifice? Amelia repeated, her voice tight with fear. That's a bit much, don't you think? Lena looked up, her expression firm. I don't think it's a coincidence that we're here now. I've disturbed something by coming back. The legend. It says that the creature only rises when someone with the blood of the lake returns. That's me. She swallowed hard, the weight of the words hitting her like a physical blow. The creature is bound to me. It's been waiting for me. The others fell silent, absorbing the gravity of her words. It was clear that whatever they were facing was beyond their comprehension. The lake, the creature, and the curse, they were all tied together in ways that made no sense. But Lena couldn't ignore the feeling that something was pulling at the edges of her memory, something from her childhood that she still couldn't fully grasp. There's more, Lena said, breaking the silence. When I was young, my grandmother told me that the creature wouldn't just attack anyone. It wouldn't rise unless the blood had a certain connection. It would only target those who were marked by fate, those who had been chosen by the lake. Elliot ran a hand through his hair. You gotta be kidding me. This is insane. I know, Lena whispered, her voice trembling. But I can't ignore it anymore. I felt it when we came back. The creature knew I was here. And it's not going to stop until it gets what it wants. A loud thud shook the cabin, followed by a deep, guttural growl that sent a shiver down their spines. The creature was still out there. Lena turned to face the others. We need to figure out what it wants. It's not just mindless rage. It's waiting for something. And I think I know where we can find out. Jacob looked skeptical. What do you mean? The library in town? No. Lena shook her head. There's an old stone circle in the woods, just north of the lake. It's part of the legend. My grandmother used to take me there when I was little. She said it was where the guardians of the lake would make their offerings, where the balance was kept. And you think there's something there that can stop this thing? Amelia asked. I'm not sure, Lena admitted, her voice low. But it's the only lead we have. If we can get to the stone circle, maybe we can figure out what the creature really wants. Maybe we can find a way to put things right. A tense silence settled over the group. The wind outside seemed to howl louder now, the sound like an animal's mournful cry. We need to move fast, Jacob said, his voice urgent. That thing, whatever it is coming for us. If we're going to survive, we need to get to the stone circle and figure out how to stop it. The others nodded, though their expressions were far from confident. The creature, whatever it was, wasn't just a monster. They all felt it in their bones now. It was something ancient, something tied to the very land itself. Let's go, Lena said, standing up. Her legs were shaky, but her resolve was iron. It's time we face whatever is waiting for us. They grabbed what little supplies they could from the cabin, flashlights, a few bags of food, and anything that might help them survive in the woods. With one last glance toward the door, Lena led the way out of the cabin. The trees seemed to close in on them as they moved deeper into the woods. The path was narrow, overgrown with thorns and vines that reached out like the hands of unseen spirits. The air grew colder with each step, the oppressive silence broken only by the occasional snap of a twig or the rustling of leaves. Lena kept her focus on the path ahead, the memory of the stone circle vivid in her mind. She could feel the weight of the forest pressing in around them, as if the trees themselves were watching, waiting. The others followed closely, their faces pale and drawn. There was no conversation now, only the sound of their footsteps and the occasional grunt or sigh. They had all seen enough to know that this was no ordinary journey. They were walking into the heart of something ancient, something powerful. After what felt like an eternity, they finally reached the clearing. The stone circle stood before them, a ring of weathered stones that had been standing for centuries. The air around the circle was thick, heavy, as if it were charged with some unseen energy. Lena's heart raced as she stepped closer, her breath coming in shallow gasps. This is it, she whispered. The others stood behind her, eyes wide with awe and fear. But as they approached the stones, the ground beneath their feet trembled, and the lake, just a few miles away, roared in fury. It was coming. The ground beneath their feet seemed to pulse, as though the very earth was alive, and the trees around them bent in unnatural ways, their branches creaking as though straining to reach the sky. Lena could feel the energy in the air, thick and suffocating. The stone circle before them stood as a testament to something ancient, its purpose forgotten by time. "Do you feel that?" Jacob whispered, his voice low as he stepped closer to Lena. Lena nodded without looking at him, her eyes locked on the stone ring. There was something alive here, something older than any of them could comprehend. The whispers from the lake were distant now, but she could still feel its presence, waiting, watching. "I don't like this," Amelia murmured, shifting from one foot to the other. "This place feels wrong." "We have a choice," Lena replied, her voice steady but filled with determination. "We need to figure out what this place is, what it's tied to. This is where the creature's power is connected. This is where the answer is." The group moved closer to the stones. They were tall. Some were larger than others, the largest standing at the center of the circle. They were weathered, their surfaces etched with symbols that Lena didn't recognize. But there was something about them, something in the arrangement that felt like a puzzle waiting to be solved. Lena stepped carefully into the circle, feeling the shift in the air around her. The others hesitated for a moment, but followed. As soon as they stepped inside, the temperature dropped. It wasn't just the air, it was the ground, the trees, the very atmosphere around them. It was as though they had crossed into another realm, one that was not entirely their own. "What do we do now?" Elliot asked, his voice tight. He was eyeing the stones nervously, and Lena could see the fear creeping into his eyes. Lena moved closer to the center, where the largest stone stood. She ran her hand across its surface, feeling the rough texture beneath her fingers. The stone was warm, almost as if it had absorbed the energy of the earth itself. Her breath quickened as she realized that this was no ordinary stone. It was a key, but to what, she wasn't sure. Suddenly, there was a deep rumble in the distance. It wasn't thunder, and it wasn't the sound of the wind. It was something else, something darker. The ground beneath them shook again, stronger this time, as if the forest itself were waking up. "It's coming," Jacob said, his voice tense. "The creature is coming. We need to figure this out now." Lena's heart raced. There was no more time to waste. She could feel the pull, the pressure in her chest, urging her to do something. Anything. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind. The guardians make their offerings here. Lena closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. She focused on the stone, the symbols carved into it, trying to decipher their meaning. As her fingers brushed over the markings, something shifted inside her, like a crack forming in her consciousness, an understanding beginning to bloom. Her grandmother had always said that the lake's curse was tied to an offering, an exchange. The guardians demanded balance, and the creature was part of that balance. It wasn't just about stopping the creature. It was about restoring that balance. "I think I understand," Lena whispered, her voice trembling. "The creature is not just guarding something. It's tied to the lake's balance. It's part of an offering, a ritual." "Well, what does that mean?" Elliot asked, stepping forward. "What do we do?" "I think," Lena's words faltered. "I think I have to offer myself." The others stared at her in shock, but Lena held up a hand before they could protest. "The creature isn't attacking us because it's mindless. It's protecting something, something that has to stay balanced. My grandmother said that the lake demands an offering when the balance is disturbed. I think the creature is waiting for me to make it." Jacob's face twisted with disbelief. "You're saying we should let you sacrifice yourself to it? That's insane, Lena." "No." Lena shook her head, her voice firm despite the fear that threatened to choke her. "It's the only way. The offering needs to be made, and it's tied to me, to my blood. I'm the one the creature's been waiting for. If I don't do this, it will never stop hunting us." The forest seemed to grow quieter as Lena spoke, the wind falling still as the others processed her words. Amelia was the first to move, stepping forward with wide, frightened eyes. "Lena, "We don't know what will happen if you do this," she said softly, her voice laced with fear. "You could be lost." "I know," Lena replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "But the creature doesn't want to kill me. It needs something from me. A sacrifice, an offering. And it's not just for the lake, it's for all of us. If I don't do this, it will never leave us alone. It will never let us go." There was a long silence, the weight of her words hanging heavy in the air. Finally, Jacob spoke, his voice thick with emotion. "If we do this, there's no going back, Lena. Are you sure about this?" Lena nodded slowly, her mind made up. She could feel the creature's presence closing in, the pressure mounting. If she didn't do this now, they'd all be doomed. There was no other choice. "I'm sure," she said, her voice steady. "I have to." She turned back to the largest stone in the center of the circle and closed her eyes. She could feel the creature growing closer, its dark presence calling to her. She knew what she had to do. Lena stepped forward, her hand reaching out to touch the stone. As her fingers made contact, the ground trembled once more, and the sky above them seemed to darken, as if the very heavens were watching. The stone hummed beneath her touch, and a low, deep sound echoed from within the circle, as though the earth itself were awakening. Lena's blood began to burn with the force of the energy, coursing through her, and for a moment, she felt as though she were standing at the edge of something vast, something infinite. And then, as if on cue, the lake roared again, a sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the world. The creature was here. The sound of the lake's roar reached a deafening crescendo, sending a wave of panic through the group. Lena's hand was still pressed firmly against the stone, her fingers burning as the ancient energy coursed through her. It felt like the very pulse of the earth was vibrating through her veins, a deep, rhythmic thrum that matched her heartbeat. The others stood frozen, too terrified to speak. They watched in a mixture of awe and horror as the stone beneath Lena's hand seemed to shift, the symbols glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. The air around them thickened, oppressive, like the very forest was holding its breath. "Lena," Jacob whispered, his voice laced with fear. "What's happening? What's going on?" Lena didn't answer right away. She could barely hear his voice over the overwhelming hum of energy flooding through her. The force was almost unbearable. The creature, she could feel it now, its presence closing in like a shadow lurking just beyond her vision. "Do it now," a voice whispered inside her head. The voice was low, ancient, and cold, as though it had come from the depths of the earth itself. "You must offer yourself to restore the balance." Lena's heart hammered in her chest. The voice wasn't hers. It was something else, something that had been waiting for this moment for her. She closed her eyes, focused on the pulse, the strange rhythm inside her. The creature was close, so close, and there was only one way to appease it. The offering was the key to everything. "I have to," she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. "The lake needs the balance, and I'm the one it wants." "No!" Jacob cried out. He lunged forward, grabbing her arm, but the moment his hand made contact, he was thrown back with an invisible force. The shock sent him stumbling to the ground, his face pale with shock. Lena gasped as the energy coursing through her intensified, and she fell to her knees, feeling her body vibrating with power. The lake's presence, the creature, it was here. She could hear its whispers now, the voices of the guardians, urging her to complete the ritual. "You have no choice," the voice in her mind whispered. "The creature will not stop until you fulfill your destiny." "I don't want to," Lena whispered, tears streaming down her face. "But I have to." She knew that if she didn't fulfill this twisted destiny, the creature would claim them all. It would never stop. The ground beneath her feet began to tremble again. The trees shook as if they were alive, their limbs stretching toward the sky, their leaves rustling with the wind. The air was heavy, charged with anticipation. Suddenly, the water from the lake surged up, as though the very lake itself was coming to meet them. The roar grew louder, and Lena's eyes widened as she saw it. The creature, A shape rising from the dark depths of the lake was taking form, a mass of writhing shadows, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light, its form far too large to be real. It was a monstrosity, a creature of nightmares. It had no face, only eyes, dark and endless. The others screamed as they saw it, terror overwhelming them. But Lena could no longer look away. The creature was there, and it was real. The stone beneath her hand began to crack, the earth splitting open as a brilliant light shot upward, casting shadows and illuminating the night in an eerie glow. Lena's body convulsed with the energy, her vision blurring as she felt herself falling into the very heart of the lake's curse. "Lena, no!" Amelia shouted, her voice frantic. But it was too late. Lena felt her body becoming weightless, as though she were floating above the ground. The lake's energy, the creature's power, was pulling her toward it. She could feel her essence, her very soul, being torn apart and remade. She closed her eyes, a strange peace settling over her, as though she were accepting her fate. The creature wasn't evil, not in the way they had believed. It wasn't just a beast, it was a force of nature, a guardian of something ancient and sacred. And she was its vessel. When Lena opened her eyes again, the world had changed. She wasn't standing in the stone circle anymore. The ground beneath her feet was soft, wet, like she was standing on the edge of the lake. But it wasn't the lake as she remembered it. The water was still, reflecting a sky that wasn't entirely real, as if the stars were shifting and dancing in ways that defied logic. The creature was there, looming in the distance, its massive form now towering above her, yet it didn't move. It simply watched her, and she felt no fear. She felt connected to it, as though they were two parts of the same whole. Lena didn't understand it, but she could feel it. This was the point of no return. Suddenly, her body was racked with pain that surged from the depths of her being, radiating outward, as though her very cells were being rewritten. Her limbs trembled as the creature's eyes glowed brighter, and she realized that the sacrifice wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. She was giving up a part of herself, a piece of her very soul. "I am the offering," Lena whispered to herself, her voice barely audible. And as she said those words, the water from the lake surged forward, wrapping around her in a cold, liquid embrace. She could feel it pulling at her, siphoning away the very essence of her being. And then, just as quickly as the pain had come, it was gone. The world around her seemed to still, as though everything had held its breath in that moment. Lena fell to her knees, her body shaking violently. But when she looked up, the creature was gone. The lake was calm, the sky had returned to its normal state, and the circle of stones around her was just a circle again. She gasped, struggling to stand, her mind a blur. It was over. It was finished. What was it? The lake, the creature, the curse. It all seemed to have vanished with the finality of a closing door. Yet, as Lena slowly turned to face the others, she realized that something inside her had changed. Something deep, something irrevocable. She was no longer the person who had come here. She was different. But how? And what would happen now? Behind her, the others were just beginning to recover from the overwhelming presence they had felt, the strange events that had transpired. Jacob, Amelia, and Elliot were slowly coming to their senses, but their eyes were filled with shock, confusion, and a deep, unspoken fear. Lena opened her mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. She didn't know what to say. They had survived, but at what cost? And as she looked out at the lake, the strange feeling of being watched washed over her once more. She wasn't sure if the creature was truly gone, or if it was merely waiting, biding its time. One thing was certain. The lake's silence was far more deadly than its roar. Lena felt the silence of the lake pressing against her like a heavy weight. The water, once a dark and mysterious force, now seemed to shimmer with a quiet, eerie calmness. It was as though the lake itself had been held in suspension, waiting for the right moment to release its secret. She looked around at the others, Jacob, Amelia, and Elliot, who were still recovering from the unnatural events that had just unfolded. They were standing in a huddled circle, their faces pale with fear and disbelief. The air felt thick with the tension of the unknown, and no one dared to speak first. Lena swallowed hard, trying to gather her thoughts. She could still feel the residual energy of the lake, like a hum beneath her skin, a pull she couldn't escape. Her connection to the creature had been severed, but the bond had left an indelible mark on her. "What happened?" Jacob asked, his voice trembling. "Where's the creature? Where did it go?" Lena didn't know how to answer him. The creature, what had it been? Was it truly gone? Her hands still tingled from where she had touched the stone, and she could feel the weight of that ancient power pressing down on her mind. The energy hadn't disappeared entirely, but it was different now, less like a presence and more like a memory, as if the lake had become a dormant force again. "It's gone, I think," Lena said, her voice sounding uncertain, even to herself. "The balance is restored. The creature, the guardians, they don't need me anymore." "Are you sure?" Amelia's voice was soft, but filled with concern. It didn't feel like it was over. It didn't feel like a good kind of silence. Lena nodded slowly, her gaze turning toward the lake. Her thoughts raced as she tried to make sense of the situation. The creature had been tied to the lake, to the curse, to the balance that had been disturbed long ago. But had she truly put an end to it, or had she merely delayed the inevitable? "I think it's over for now," Lena replied. "But something tells me it's not finished. Not completely." Elliot shuddered, rubbing his arms as if to shake off the cold. "I don't know how you can be so calm. I feel like we're just waiting for the other shoe to drop." "Maybe we are," Lena admitted, her eyes drawn back to the lake. "But if we don't leave now, it might be too late." The others glanced at one another, and Jacob gave a slow nod. "I agree. We've done what we came here for. We've stopped the creature, whatever it was." Lena's throat tightened at his words. The others weren't wrong. They'd come to this place to find answers, to stop the creature and whatever curse had been placed on the lake. But in the pit of her stomach, Lena couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was still yet to come. "We should go," Lena said, more to herself than to anyone else. As they began to make their way back through the woods, the quiet seemed to follow them. The trees no longer creaked ominously. The rustling of the leaves no longer seemed menacing. The forest had returned to its natural state, calm, peaceful, almost serene. But there was an unease that had settled into Lena's chest. She couldn't explain it, but the more she walked, the more she felt as though something was watching her, something that hadn't been fully appeased. When they reached the edge of the forest, the distant sounds of the town seemed to break the silence. It was a comforting sound at first, the bustling of life returning to normal. But as Lena turned one last glance over her shoulder, the weight of what they'd done pressed down on her once again. She had given herself to the lake. She had sacrificed something, and in return, the creature had disappeared, but only temporarily. The bond she'd forged with it, the connection to the lake, was still there, lingering like a shadow in the back of her mind. She had hoped that leaving the lake would end the terror, but she now knew the truth. Some things could never be fully erased. A week passed since they'd left the lake, and life began to return to normal. Jacob, Amelia, Elliot, and Lena went back to their regular routines, their connection to the haunting events slowly fading into the background of their daily lives. But for Lena, it wasn't enough to forget. She couldn't escape the constant feeling that the lake was still out there, waiting for something. The weight in her chest had grown over the days. It wasn't a physical sensation, but more like an emotional pressure, an unshakable feeling of dread. She couldn't explain it, but she couldn't ignore it either. The dreams were the worst part. Every night, Lena dreamt of the lake. Sometimes it was peaceful, the water calm and still under the pale moonlight. But sometimes it was chaotic, turbulent waves crashing against the shore, dark shadows emerging from the depths to pull her under. She would wake in a cold sweat, her heart racing, and the haunting feeling of the lake would linger with her throughout the day. One evening, Lena sat at her window, staring out at the quiet streets of her town. She couldn't shake the thought that something had been left unfinished. It was as though she had interrupted a story that had not yet been told. The phone rang, startling her from her thoughts. She picked it up quickly. "Lena, it's Jacob," came his voice, low and tense. "You need to come to the old church. It's happening again." Lena's stomach dropped. "I'll be there," she replied, already grabbing her jacket. The feeling of dread she'd been carrying for days seemed to spike in an instant, and she knew, deep down, that this wasn't over. Lena arrived at the old church just after dusk, the fading light casting long shadows across the crumbling stone exterior. The building was quiet, almost too quiet, save for the distant sound of wind rustling through the trees. Jacob, Amelia, and Elliot were already there, standing in front of the church, their faces pale with anxiety. "What's going on?" Lena asked, her voice shaky despite her attempts to steady herself. Jacob didn't answer immediately. He just nodded toward the church doors. They were ajar, and the air around them seemed unnaturally still, like the church was holding its breath. "I don't know how to explain this," Jacob said, his voice tight, "but it's happening again. The lake. It's like it's calling to us." Lena's stomach tightened. She hadn't been sure how to feel about the lake's silence. She had hoped, prayed, that their intervention had truly stopped whatever curse had haunted the place. But now, standing in front of the church, she couldn't deny the sinking feeling in her chest. "We need to go inside," Amelia urged, her voice soft but urgent. Lena hesitated, her hand hovering over the door. She felt a chill run down her spine as the wind whispered through the trees, like some unseen force was urging them inside. Reluctantly, she stepped forward, pushing the door open with a low creak. The inside of the church was dark, save for a few candles flickering near the altar. The air smelled musty, and the old wooden pews were covered in dust, as if no one had stepped foot in the church for years. The only sound was the faint hum of the wind outside, but even that felt distant and muffled. "Do you feel that?" Elliot whispered. His voice was barely audible, but the tension in it was unmistakable. Lena nodded slowly. The air felt thick, almost electric. It was as though the walls themselves were alive, vibrating with a strange, foreign energy. She felt the familiar pull from the lake again, like an invisible thread tethering her to the water. The bond, the one she thought she had severed, was still there, stronger than ever. And then she heard it, a low, guttural sound, almost like a growl, emanating from somewhere deep within the church. It was faint, but it was unmistakable. The sound of something alive, something that had been waiting. "What was that?" Amelia asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Lena replied, her breath shallow. "But we need to find out." She stepped deeper into the church, her eyes scanning the shadows. The candles flickered, casting long, wavering shadows on the walls. In the corner of her eye, Lena thought she saw something move, an indistinct shape, just beyond the reach of the candlelight. Without thinking, she walked toward it, her footsteps echoing in the silent church. The others followed, their faces filled with unease, but they didn't speak. The tension was unbearable, thick and suffocating. As Lena reached the back of the church, she stopped. There, standing in the shadow of the altar, was a figure. A man, or what had once been a man. His form was distorted, half hidden in the dark, but his eyes, those eyes, glowed with an unnatural light, a sickly green that pulsed like a heartbeat. Lena's breath caught in her throat. She knew that face. "Jacob," she whispered, barely able to breathe. But it wasn't Jacob. It was something else, a twisted reflection of him, a mimic of his form. The figure spoke in a voice that wasn't his, but familiar, deep and resonant. "You have returned, Lena." Lena recoiled, her heart racing. The figure's lips twisted into a grotesque smile, and the room grew colder. "It's not over." It continued, its voice low and gravelly. "You thought you ended the curse, but you only awakened it. You are part of it now. And the lake. It calls. Lena, get back." Jacob shouted, rushing forward. But as he took a step, the figure raised its hand, and the air around them shifted, thickening like a fog. Jacob stopped in his tracks. eyes wide in shock and terror. The figure's glowing eyes fixed on Lena. You were the sacrifice, the key to this curse. But now you will return. Lena felt a sharp pain in her chest, as if something deep inside her was being ripped apart. She staggered backward, gasping for air, the weight of the creature's words sinking in her mind like a poison. "Lena!" Amelia cried, rushing to her side. But Lena couldn't respond. She couldn't breathe. The energy from the creature was overwhelming, suffocating her, pulling her toward it like an irresistible current. "You are bound to the lake, now and forever," the figure continued, its voice growing louder. "You thought you could end it, but the creature was never meant to be destroyed. It is an ancient force, and it will never let you go." Lena's vision blurred. She stumbled, falling to her knees, the pressure in her chest unbearable. The creature's presence was suffocating her, consuming her. "Lena, we have to get out of here," Jacob shouted, but his voice seemed distant, muffled, as if the church itself was swallowing them whole. The figure took a step forward, its form shifting in the shadows, becoming even more grotesque. The glowing eyes were all that remained of its human shape, now twisted beyond recognition. Lena's mind spun. She thought of the lake, of the creature, of the bond she had formed with it. Had she really believed she could leave it behind? Could she ever escape the pull of the lake? She felt herself teetering on the edge of something dark, something ancient, and she knew she was about to fall. Suddenly, a sharp, thunderous noise erupted, and the figure froze. The air around them crackled, as though the very fabric of reality had been torn. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, leaving nothing but an oppressive silence in its wake. Lena was left on the floor, gasping for air, her heart pounding in her chest. The coldness of the room, the presence of the creature, it had all disappeared. "Lena," Jacob's voice was shaky as he knelt beside her. "What just happened?" Lena couldn't answer him. Her mind was spinning, her thoughts scattered. She could still feel the creature's eyes, still hear its voice in her head, a whisper that wouldn't go away. The lake was calling again. Lena's head was spinning as she struggled to stand. Jacob's hand, warm and steady, gripped her arm, helping her up. His face was etched with concern, but something else was there too, fear. They all felt it, the quiet terror that still hung in the air after the disappearance of the creature. "What happened to it?" Amelia asked softly, her voice cracking as she took a hesitant step forward. "Where did it go?" Lena shook her head, her thoughts a blur. The figure, no, the thing, had vanished, but its presence still lingered, heavy and oppressive. She could still feel its gaze on her, as if it were watching, waiting for the next move. "I don't know," Lena said, her voice hoarse. It spoke to me, but it wasn't Jacob. It wasn't human. It was like it knew me, like it had been waiting for me. "Waiting for you?" Elliot's voice rose, filled with disbelief. "How? What does it mean?" Lena's mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of what had just happened. The figure, its glowing eyes, its twisted voice, had seemed to recognize her, to understand something she couldn't fully grasp. "I think." Lena hesitated, swallowing hard. "I think it's connected to the lake. That bond one formed with it. The one I thought I severed. I don't think it's gone. It's still here inside me." The group exchanged uneasy glances. No one said anything, but the weight of Lena's words hung heavily between them. "We need to leave," Jacob said firmly, pulling her towards the door. "The lake isn't done with us yet. We need to get away from here before." Before what? Lena thought, but she couldn't bring herself to voice it. Whatever had just happened in the church, it wasn't the end. If anything, it felt like the beginning of something worse. The drive back to town was silent, each of them lost in their own thoughts. The road seemed longer than it had before, the trees along the way growing denser and darker, as if the forest was closing in on them. Lena's hand shook as she gripped the door handle, her fingers numb from the cold. "You're right," she said quietly, breaking the silence. "We can't just leave. The lake won't let us go that easily." Jacob's grip on the steering wheel tightened, but he didn't respond. The weight of what Lena had said settled in his chest, and he couldn't deny the truth of it. They had all been touched by the lake in some way. It had called to them, it had claimed them, and it had never let go. "I thought we could escape it," Amelia said suddenly, her voice trembling. "But I'm starting to think that was never possible. What if it was always meant to be like this? What if we were always meant to be part of it?" "I don't know," Lena whispered, "but I can't keep running. We need to go back. We need to face whatever this is before it consumes us." Elliot glanced at her, his expression. "You don't mean go to the lake? After everything?" Lena nodded slowly. "I think we have to. If we don't, whatever's left in that church, whatever that thing was, it's going to keep coming for us. And this time, I'm not sure we'll be able to stop it." They reached town, the quiet streets illuminated by the faint glow of streetlights. It was late now, the shadows stretching long across the pavement. The town seemed peaceful on the surface, but beneath it all, Lena could feel the unease, the dark energy that pulsed in the background. The lake wasn't done. She could feel it in her bones. They didn't waste any time. The group gathered their things, what little they could bring, and made their way back to the outskirts of town, toward the path that led to the lake. It felt like the very earth beneath them was pulling them toward it, as if the ground itself was complicit in the curse that bound them. The forest grew darker as they walked, the trees seeming to close in around them. Lena could hear her breath echo in her ears, and the rustling of leaves was the only sound that broke the silence. It was as though the entire world had gone still, waiting for what was to come. "I don't like this," Elliot muttered, glancing nervously around. "We should have stayed at the church. There's something off about all of this." Amelia was silent, her gaze fixed straight ahead, her face pale in the dim light. She was holding herself together, but Lena could tell that the fear was eating away at her. Lena herself felt the same way. The closer they got to the lake, the more intense the pull became, like an invisible force tugging at her heart. She could feel the connection growing stronger, feel the lake calling to her, beckoning her forward. Finally, they reached the shore, and the sight of the water sent a shiver down Lena's spine. It was still like glass, the moonlight reflecting off its surface in a silver sheen. There was no sound, no movement, just the eerie silence that had haunted them since they first encountered the lake. "Is it here?" Jacob asked, his voice low. Lena stepped forward, her gaze fixed on the water. She could feel it now, the deep, primal connection that had always been there. The lake was waiting. "I think it's here," Lena whispered, "but I don't know if we're ready." Before anyone could say anything else, a soft ripple spread across the water, breaking the stillness. Lena froze, her breath catching in her throat. She stepped back, but the ripple continued, growing larger, more forceful. Then, from beneath the water, something began to emerge. At first, it was just a shadow, barely visible against the dark water. But as it rose, it became clear something massive, something ancient, something that had been lurking in the depths all this time. It was the creature, the one she had bound herself to. Its form was barely recognizable now, twisted and monstrous, its body covered in strange markings that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the lake itself. Its glowing eyes fixed on Lena, and she felt the pull once more. The bond between them was undeniable, stronger than ever. And she knew, in that moment, that this would never end. The lake had claimed her, and it would never let go. Lena stood frozen at the edge of the lake, her heart pounding in her chest as the creature's massive form began to emerge from the water. It was no longer a mere shadow, but a monstrous shape, an entity that seemed to stretch on forever, its body shifting and writhing as though made of liquid darkness. Her mind raced, but her body felt numb, as if she were being pulled toward the thing before her, like a puppet controlled by strings. It spoke to her without words. Its presence alone communicated everything. It was the lake itself, the curse that had festered for centuries, waiting for the right moment to claim her. "Run!" Jacob's voice shattered the heavy silence, breaking the trance. He grabbed Lena's arm, pulling her back, but it was too late. The creature's glowing eyes locked onto hers, and she felt a sharp, almost electric pain surge through her body. The connection between them was undeniable, and it was as though the very earth beneath her feet was feeding her to the thing that waited below. She wanted to pull away, to resist, but her body wouldn't obey. The lake had her, and the creature would never let her go. Lena! Jacob's voice trembled as he tugged harder, but Lena's feet were rooted to the ground, her eyes locked on the creature that had been calling to her. Get away from it, Amelia pleaded, stepping toward Lena, her voice breaking. Lena could barely hear them now. Her entire focus was on the creature, which seemed to sense her submission, its form slowly rising higher from the water. Its skin, if you could even call it skin, was slick and glistening, like the surface of the lake itself, reflecting the moonlight in ripples of dark, oily waves. It had long, sinewy limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally, and its mouth was a gaping maw, full of sharp teeth that shimmered with a cold light. Suddenly, Lena felt the grip on her arm tighten. Jacob was pulling her again, his voice breaking through the fog of terror in her mind. Lena, listen to me. We need to fight this. We need to leave. But Lena could not move. Her body was frozen, her mind screaming, don't fight it. It's where you belong. It's your destiny. The voice was not her own. It was the lake, the thing that controlled it. The thing that had been pulling her in since she had first stepped foot in that cursed water. She could feel it growing stronger, its influence growing deeper within her. And then, with a force that rattled her bones, the creature spoke. You belong to me, Lena. You are my vessel. The lake will consume you, as it has consumed so many before you. You will be the last, and the cycle will begin again. No, Lena whispered, her voice trembling with fear and defiance. I won't let you. But it was useless. The creature's grip tightened on her soul, like invisible hands pressing against her chest, forcing her to bend to its will. The others were still yelling, but Lena could barely hear them over the deafening sound of her own heartbeat, the pounding in her ears growing louder with every passing second. Let her go, Jacob shouted, but the creature didn't seem to notice. Lena's mind reeled, but she felt herself being dragged closer, step by step, toward the lake, toward the creature. It was no longer a force she could fight, but one that was pulling her in with an irresistible pull, like gravity itself. Then, in a sudden moment of clarity, a single thought struck her like a lightning bolt. I have to break the bond. The lake had claimed her, but it didn't have to be this way. It was pulling her in, but that didn't mean it had to win. She just had to sever the connection, break free from the curse. But how? A memory flashed in her mind, a vision of the church, the candles flickering in the darkness. She had seen something then, a symbol etched into the floor. It had been faint, barely visible in the shadows, but it had felt important. The key. Without thinking, Lena turned toward the others. The church, she gasped. We need to go back to the church. It's the only way. Jacob's face contorted with confusion, but there was no time to explain. Lena could feel the creature growing stronger, its influence surging, threatening to take over her mind. Now, Lena shouted, pulling herself away from Jacob's grip, her feet moving against her will. We have to go. Without waiting for a response, Lena bolted back toward the trees, her legs moving almost mechanically, her feet pounding against the earth. The others followed behind her, unsure but desperate. The forest felt darker now, more oppressive than before. The trees pressed in on them as if they were trying to keep them trapped in the woods, but Lena pushed on. The bond was still there, pulling her toward the lake, toward the creature, but she fought it with everything she had. She had to get to the church. She had to find a symbol and break the connection once and for all. They arrived at the church in a breathless frenzy. Lena stumbled through the door, her heart pounding in her chest. The candles were still lit, flickering against the cold, musty air. But everything else seemed the same, unchanged from their earlier visit. Lena's eyes scanned the floor, searching for the symbol. It had been there. She was sure of it. There's no time, Jacob said, his voice frantic. Lena, we need to... But Lena wasn't listening. Her gaze locked onto the altar, where a faint symbol carved into the stone glowed with an otherworldly light. It was the same symbol she had seen in her vision, the one that held the key to breaking the curse. Lena rushed forward, her fingers trembling as she traced the symbol on the altar. The moment her hand touched it, a surge of energy blasted through her, and the ground beneath her feet began to shake. The church seemed to groan, as if something ancient and powerful was stirring beneath the earth. "No!" The creature's voice rumbled, deep and guttural, echoing in her mind. "You cannot break free. You belong to me." But Lena didn't stop. She pressed her palm against the symbol, focusing all her will on severing the connection. The air grew thick with tension, and the very walls of the church seemed to warp, as if reality itself was twisting. "Lena, hurry!" Amelia screamed, but Lena barely heard her. The creature's presence was overwhelming, its voice ringing in her ears, its power threatening to crush her. But Lena held firm, feeling the symbol begin to pulse with energy beneath her hand. Slowly, the air around her began to shift, the oppressive weight lifting, as if something was being broken, undone. And then, with a final, deafening crack, everything went still. The church fell silent, the oppressive energy lifting, and the bond that had bound Lena to the lake finally snapped. Lena fell to her knees, gasping for air, her body shaking. The connection was gone. The lake's pull had been broken. But something else was wrong. She looked up, her vision blurry, and saw the altar before her, the symbol now fading into the stone. The creature was gone, but its presence still lingered, like a shadow on the edge of her vision. "Is it over?" Jacob's voice was filled with cautious hope. Lena didn't know. She didn't have the strength to answer. But deep inside, she knew the truth. Whatever they had done, it wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Lena's breath came in ragged gasps as she slowly rose from the cold stone floor, her hands trembling. The symbol had disappeared, but the tension in the air hadn't. It was as if the church, the land, the very atmosphere around them were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. Jacob was the first to move, his steps quick as he rushed to her side. "Lena, are you okay? What's going on? What happened?" His eyes darted nervously around the church, as if expecting the ground to swallow them up at any moment. Lena didn't have the strength to answer. Her mind was still reeling from the intense pull of the lake, the creature's whispers in her ear. She could still hear its voice echoing in her skull, a constant reminder of the bond that had nearly consumed her. I think it's gone," she whispered, though doubt crept into her words. Her heart was still pounding, and she couldn't shake the sensation that the darkness had only been pushed back, not vanquished. "But it's not over. It can't be." Amelia, who had been standing silently by the door, finally spoke up. "You broke the bond. You stopped it from controlling you, Lena. That's a victory, right?" Her voice was shaky, but she was trying to remain hopeful. Lena nodded weakly, but couldn't bring herself to say it was over. She had felt the creature retreat, but it was still there, in the recesses of her mind, in the pulse of the earth beneath her feet. She had freed herself, yes, but only for now. Elliot, who had been pacing near the altar, turned toward them with a dark look in his eyes. "I don't trust it. That thing, whatever it was, it's not just going to disappear. We've only scratched the surface of whatever hell is tied to this place." Lena swallowed hard, forcing herself to her feet, though her legs felt weak. I know it's not over, but we need to leave this church. It's a hollow victory if we stay here, waiting for the next thing to happen." Without waiting for a response, she turned and made her way toward the door, her steps hesitant but resolute. The others followed her, though each of them seemed on edge, as if the very air was thick with unseen danger. The drive back to town was silent. The weight of their recent ordeal hung heavily between them, each person lost in their own thoughts. The church had felt like a place of temporary safety, but Lena knew the truth now. The lake, the creature, whatever it wasn't tied to any one place. It was tied to them. As the car rumbled down the dark road, Lena stared out the window, her gaze fixed on the distant trees. The lake loomed in her mind, its presence still haunting her. She could feel it calling to her, pulling at her, whispering that this wasn't the end. It had never been the end. "We need to keep moving," Jacob said after a long silence, his voice barely audible. "The town is too close to the lake. It won't stop until it has us all." Lena nodded, though she didn't feel entirely convinced. "Maybe we need to leave the area. Leave this town behind for good. We don't know what else is out there." "We can't just run forever," Elliot muttered. "We need to find out what it is, what it wants. We need to face it, not hide from it." "We don't have to face it alone," Amelia added softly, glancing at each of them in turn. "We've already broken the connection, but we need to figure out how to make sure it never comes back." What happened in the church? It was just the start. Lena felt her pulse quicken. Amelia was right, but it wasn't an answer. They hadn't broken free. They had just begun to understand the forces at play. And the lake, that vast, ancient body of water, was still out there waiting. They decided to spend the night in a motel on the outskirts of town. It wasn't ideal, but it offered some distance from the lake, even if only for a few hours. The group settled in, the exhaustion from their harrowing experience taking its toll. Lena lay awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling, unable to escape the thoughts swirling in her mind. The creature was still there. It hadn't been vanquished. It was patient, too patient. The phone on the bedside table buzzed, jolting Lena out of her thoughts. She glanced at the screen, and a cold chill ran down her spine. It was a message from an unknown number. "You're not done yet. The lake has claimed you. It will not let go." Lena's fingers shook as she read the message, her heart hammering in her chest. She quickly turned to the others, who were already awake, looking at her with concern. "Lena, what is it?" Jacob asked. "The lake is reaching out again," she whispered, showing them the phone. "It's not over." "Is it possible?" Amelia asked, her voice tight with fear. "Is it possible to break it completely? To end this nightmare?" Lena's mind raced. "I don't know, but I know one thing for sure. It's never just going to let us go. We have to find out everything we can about the lake. Its history, its origins, everything." Elliot leaned forward, his face grim. "I've done some research on this place. There's something wrong about this town, something that dates back centuries. The lake was a part of a ritual, a way to keep something buried beneath its surface. But something happened, and whatever is down, there was never supposed to be freed." "So it's a curse?" Jacob asked. Lena nodded, swallowing hard. "I think so. The lake has always had power, but now it's looking for something. Something or someone." Amelia looked at her with dread. "Lena, you said the creature spoke to you. What did it say?" Lena's heart sank as she recalled the words. "It said I belong to it, that I'm the last part of the cycle, that the lake has claimed me, and I can never leave." The room grew deathly silent. And then, with a sinking feeling, Lena realized the truth. She had never been meant to escape. The creature wasn't after just her. It was after all of them. The next morning, the group made plans to investigate the lake's dark history. If they were to have any hope of stopping the creature, they needed answers. But the weight of the task hung over them like a dark cloud. Lena couldn't shake the feeling that every step they took would bring them closer to something even worse, something far darker than they could imagine. They decided to start at the town's local archives, hoping to find records or old news clippings about strange occurrences, disappearances, or anything related to the lake. As they entered the small building, they were greeted by a quiet, elderly woman who looked at them with curiosity but didn't ask any questions. Lena, Jacob, Amelia, and Elliot spread out, rummaging through dusty folders and stacks of papers. The air was thick with the scent of old books, the silence almost oppressive. Lena's fingers trembled as she sifted through old newspaper clippings from decades past. The stories were chilling, mysterious disappearances, families who vanished overnight, fishermen found dead with expressions of terror frozen on their faces. But there was something else, something that stood out in the record she found. A headline caught her eye: "The Dark Waters, Ancient Rituals and Unsettling Secrets." The article detailed a strange event that occurred many years ago, before the town's founding, when settlers arrived in the area. According to the piece, The lake had long been a place of superstition and reverence, a sacred site for the indigenous people who believed it was a gateway to something far older, something buried deep beneath the surface. The article explained how settlers had disrupted the rituals meant to keep something sealed within the lake. They drained part of the water to create farmland, disturbing the burial grounds and unleashing something that had remained dormant for centuries. Lena's eyes widened. The lake was not just a body of water, it was a prison. And now, something had been freed. "Hey, Lena," Jacob called from across the room, his voice tinged with excitement. "You need to see this." Lena walked over to him, her heart racing. He was holding an old journal, worn with age. The leather cover was cracked, and it looked like it hadn't been opened in years. "What is it?" she asked, her breath catching in her throat. "It's a diary," he replied, flipping through the pages. "It belonged to someone who was here when the settlers first arrived. There are a lot of mentions of the lake, of something evil." Lena leaned over his shoulder and read. One entry stood out. "The lake calls to us in the night, and I cannot shake the feeling that it has always been watching. There is something beneath the surface, something ancient and hungry. We were warned about it, but we thought the old stories were nothing more than superstition. I was wrong." The entry ended abruptly, as though the writer had been interrupted mid-sentence. It was chilling, but it was the next passage that made Lena's skin crawl. "The settlers have done something to the lake. I fear that something has been awakened. I've seen things moving beneath the surface, things that should not exist. I can hear its whispers in my mind. It wants something, but I do not know what. It is waiting, and I am afraid." Jacob's voice dropped to a whisper. "Whatever is in the lake, it's been waiting a long time." Lena's blood ran cold. This was bigger than they had realized. The creature was no accident. It was part of a much older curse that had been disturbed. It had been dormant for centuries, and now, after all this time, it was stirring. "We need to find a ritual," Lena said, her voice filled with urgency. "We need to figure out how to seal it away again before it's too late." Elliot joined them, holding a piece of paper he'd found. "There's something here about the ritual. It says the seal can only be broken under a specific alignment of the stars. It's tied to the lunar cycle." Lena's heart skipped a beat. The stars. The moon. She remembered the night at the lake, the way the full moon had cast a strange glow on the water, how everything had felt wrong. "We don't have much time," she said, her voice strained. "We need to stop this now." The sky darkened as the day wore on. The group made their way back to the lake, now armed with the knowledge they had gathered. The ritual, if they could find the right location and perform it correctly, could seal the creature back beneath the water. But the full moon was only a few hours away, and time was running out. The air was thick with tension as they approached the lake once again, the creature's presence still lurking in the back of Lena's mind. She could feel it, its cold, ancient eyes watching them from the depths. They reached the clearing where the ritual was supposed to take place. The moon hung low in the sky, its light casting an eerie glow over the water. The trees seemed to close in around them, as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. Lena looked at the others. "We don't know what will happen when we perform this. We're trying to undo something that was disturbed long ago, but it's our only chance." Jacob nodded, his face grim but determined. "Let's do it." They gathered around a circle etched into the ground, the same symbol they had seen before in the church. Lena closed her eyes, drawing on everything she had learned from the journal, from the old rituals, and from her own experiences with the lake. As the moon rose higher in the sky, its light intensified, casting strange shadows on the water. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the sense that they were being watched. Lena began to chant softly, following the instructions from the journal. Slowly, the others joined in. Their voices echoed in the night, and the air grew heavier, as if the lake itself was responding. At first, nothing happened, but then, as Lena recited the final words of the incantation, a tremor shook the ground beneath them. The surface of the lake rippled violently, and the water began to churn, as if something was rising from the depths. The creature's form broke the surface of the water again, But this time, it was not coming toward them. It was being pulled back. Its massive form writhed and twisted as though in agony. Its monstrous eyes locked on Lena, Jacob, and the others. "No," the creature's voice roared in her mind. "You cannot stop me. I will not be sealed again." But Lena kept chanting, her voice unwavering, her mind focused on the ritual. She could feel the energy building around them, the pull of the lake's dark power weakening with each passing second. With one final, deafening crack, the creature let out a terrible, soul-shattering scream. The water exploded upward, but before it could engulf them, a brilliant light erupted from the ground beneath their feet. The lake trembled, and with a final surge of force, the creature was sucked back into the depths. And then all was still. The light faded, and the lake became calm once again. The oppressive air that had hung over the land lifted, and the world felt different, quieter. Lena stood frozen, her heart racing as she looked out over the water. The creature was gone, at least for now, but the peace felt fragile, as if the lake's power could stir once again if they weren't careful. "It's over," Jacob said, his voice hoarse. Lena nodded, but she didn't feel relieved. "For now." They turned away from the lake and began to walk back, knowing that whatever had happened, the creature might one day rise again. But for tonight, at least, they were safe. The silent lake was quiet once more. As the group made their way back toward the town, the atmosphere around them felt unsettlingly normal, too normal. The stars shone brightly overhead, and the air had a crisp chill, but there was something off about it. Lena's mind raced, replaying every moment of what had happened at the lake. The ritual, the ancient being beneath the water, and the chilling silence that followed the creature's disappearance. Despite the silence that enveloped the area, a constant unease settled over Lena's heart. They had defeated it for now, but had they truly sealed it away? Or had they only delayed the inevitable? As they passed the outskirts of the forest, the low hum of the town could be heard, distant but familiar. Jacob turned to Lena, his face tired but resolute. "Do you think it's really over?" Lena hesitated, taking in the night sky. "No, I don't think it is. We sealed the creature, but there's too much we don't understand about the lake, about what happened when the settlers disturbed it." Amelia spoke up from behind them, her voice sharp and trembling with fear. "But we can't just keep going back there, can we? We stopped it, didn't we? We need to get away. We need to leave this place behind." Lena glanced over her shoulder. "It's not that simple." Elliot, who had been eerily quiet for most of the evening, cleared his throat and spoke up. "I agree with Lena. Whatever was in that lake isn't gone for good. The town, this whole place, is built on the ashes of something older than all of us. The ritual might have stopped it for now, but it might take more than just words to stop it permanently. There's something deeper here." They walked in silence for a moment, the weight of the truth they had uncovered settling over them like a cold, heavy fog. They needed answers, answers that could only be found by looking further into the lake's cursed past. The next morning, they met at the town's local diner. The sun shone brightly through the windows, but the warmth of the day did little to shake the gnawing feeling that the battle wasn't truly over. "I've been thinking," Lena said as she stirred her coffee, trying to ignore the ache in her bones. "The lake's curse didn't just start with the settlers. That much is clear. The indigenous people who lived here before them. They knew something we don't understand." Jacob leaned forward. "So, you want to go back to the lake?" "No," Lena answered quickly, shaking her head. "I want to go to the town's historical society. There has to be more there, records, diaries, something that could tell us more about what happened before the settlers arrived." Elliot shifted in his seat. "I'm with you. We need to dig deeper into the past. If we don't, we might be inviting the creature back." The group agreed to head to the historical society later that afternoon. They couldn't shake the feeling that the answers they sought were buried in the town's past, waiting to be unearthed. The historical society was a small, dusty building tucked away at the edge of town. The moment Lena stepped inside, a musty smell filled her nostrils, old paper, leather-bound books, and decades of forgotten memories. They were greeted by an elderly woman named Ruth, who had worked at the society for as long as anyone could remember. She wore thick glasses perched on the end of her nose, and her face was lined with the wisdom of years spent cataloging the history of the town. "We need to know everything you have in the town, Lena said, her voice firm, despite the anxiety bubbling in her chest. Ruth raised an eyebrow, but didn't question them. "You're looking for something specific?" Lena hesitated. "Anything about the lake's history? Strange occurrences, the indigenous people, rituals, anything." Ruth gave a curt nod and gestured toward a set of shelves lined with old journals and records. "There are records in the back. The early history of the town's founding is there, but you may also want to look into the journals from the native tribes. Some things might still be sensitive." "Thank you," Lena said, heading toward the back room, followed closely by Jacob, Amelia, and Elliot. They spent hours sifting through ancient documents, old maps, and faded photographs. It was painstaking work, but eventually they found something that sent a cold chill down their spines. A journal from a man named Edward Fox, one of the first settlers in the area. The entry read, "We found it today, deep within the forest. The natives spoke of it as a place of silence, but they never told us what lay beneath the waters. We have made camp by the lake, and there is a strange stillness in the air. The trees do not rustle, and the water does not ripple. I fear we have disturbed something ancient. The natives warned us to leave, but we have pressed on. I must admit, there is a part of me that is drawn to the lake, as if something is calling to me." Lena's fingers tightened around the pages. There was again the feeling of being drawn to the lake. That terrible pull. The next entry made her stomach twist. "We have made a terrible mistake. Last night, the wind howled like a pack of wolves, but the lake seemed to cry out in a voice like no other. Something rose from the depths, something monstrous and ancient. The natives tried to stop us, but it was too late. We've awoken it. The beast is real." Lena turned the pages quickly, desperate for more. But the final entry was short and haunting. "We have sealed it, but I fear it will return. The lake will never forget. Neither will I." "Edward Fox," Jacob murmured, scanning the journal with a grim expression. He was the one who led the settlers here, and he knew something was wrong. He knew the creature wasn't gone. "We need to find out more about the seal," Lena said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The creature wasn't banished. It was sealed. And someone has to keep that seal intact." Elliot swallowed hard. "You think someone broke it? Or is trying to?" Lena's mind raced. Could it be? Could the seal have weakened over time? Could someone have uncovered the forgotten rituals and tried to unlock whatever lay beneath? "We need to go back to the lake," Lena said, her heart pounding in her chest. "We need to find the seal. Before it's too late." The group left the historical society with heavy hearts, a sense of dread hanging in the air. The answers they had uncovered only raised more questions. And now, with the knowledge of what the lake truly hid, they had to return. The creature wasn't gone. It was waiting. And the only thing that stood between it and the world above was a broken seal, and a promise made long ago. The sun was beginning to dip behind the trees as the group made their way back to the lake. The air had grown heavy with anticipation, each step forward carrying the weight of what they knew and what they feared they might encounter. Lena led the way, her eyes constantly scanning the path ahead, knowing that the closer they got to the water, the stronger the pull would be. "We have to stay focused," Lena muttered, half to herself. "This isn't just about us anymore." Jacob nodded, but didn't reply. His eyes were dark, lost in thought as they trudged through the underbrush, his hand resting on the hunting knife he'd brought along, though he hadn't spoken of it. It was an unspoken truth. They didn't know what they were about to face, but they had to be ready for anything. Amelia walked quietly behind him, her face pale. "What do you think the seal will look like?" she asked, her voice tight with nerves. "I don't know," Lena replied, "but I'll recognize it when I see it." The trees thinned as they reached the clearing where the lake lay, its black surface eerily still. No ripples disturbed the water, and it felt as though the entire world was holding its breath. Lena stopped at the edge, her heart racing in her chest. The place felt different now, darker, more oppressive. It was as though the lake itself had sensed their return, its depths watching, waiting. "We're not alone," Elliot said suddenly, his voice low. He glanced nervously over his shoulder, scanning the surrounding woods. "I can feel it." Lena's hand instinctively reached for the dagger at her side, her senses on high alert. "Stay sharp." The group spread out slightly, each person scanning their surroundings. The oppressive silence seemed even heavier here, as though the lake itself was holding them in its grip. Lena's eyes flickered over the water, searching for any sign of the creature or the seal. There had to be something left, something that had been overlooked in their earlier search. "Over there," Jacob said, pointing to a section of the shoreline where the trees grew thicker. "There's something different about that area." Lena's gaze followed his finger, and her breath caught. There, half hidden behind the trees, was a large stone, weathered and cracked. The markings on it were faint, worn away by time, but there was something undeniably ancient about it, something powerful. "That's it," Lena said, her voice a whisper of awe and fear. "That's the seal." Without another word, they hurried toward the stone, their movements swift and purposeful. As they approached, Lena could feel the air grow colder, the sensation of being watched intensifying. The stone was enormous, covered in moss and vines, but the markings on it, although faded, were unmistakable. Symbols, a language no one had spoken in centuries. There were traces of red near the base of the stone, as though something had once been drawn there, something bloody. Lena knelt beside the stone, her fingers grazing the symbols. "This is it, the seal. It's here. What happened to it?" Jacob asked, kneeling beside her. "Why isn't it working anymore?" Lena's brow furrowed as she examined the stone more closely. "It's been tampered with. Look, these markings. They're newer. Someone's been here recently." Amelia stepped forward, eyes wide. "You mean someone's been trying to break the seal?" Lena nodded grimly. "That's exactly what I mean. And if they've succeeded." A low growl interrupted her, a deep, guttural sound that reverberated through the ground beneath their feet. The earth seemed to tremble, and the hairs on the back of Lena's neck stood on end. "They're here," Lena said, standing quickly, her heart pounding. "Get ready." Suddenly, the water began to ripple, slowly at first, then more violently, as though something massive was rising from the depths. The air turned cold, and the shadows around them deepened. Something was coming. The lake began to churn, its black waters foaming as something enormous, broke the surface. A creature like none Lena had ever seen, a twisted combination of shadow and nightmare, its massive form towering over them as it emerged. It had eyes that burned with a feral, unnatural light, and its form shimmered with an otherworldly energy. Lena's breath caught in her throat. It was the beast, the one from the ancient records, the one that had haunted this place for centuries. "Run!" Jacob shouted, but his voice was barely audible over the monstrous growl that now filled the air. They didn't need to be told twice. In a flash, they turned and sprinted back toward the tree lead. The beast surged forward, its massive claws crashing through the water, reaching for them with terrifying speed. Lena's heart pounded in her chest as she ran, but she couldn't outrun the feeling of dread that clung to her. The lake had risen, and the creature had returned. The seal had been broken. They reached the trees, breathless and terrified, but the creature didn't stop. The beast seemed to follow them, its roars echoing through the woods. "We need to finish this," Lena gasped. "The seal, there's a way to stop it, but we have to do it together." Elliot, panting beside her, nodded. "What do we do?" "We have to restore the seal," Lena said, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her insides. "There's a ritual. It's in the journals. We have to recreate it before the creature destroys everything." They couldn't afford to wait. They had to face the beast, not just for their own survival, but for the survival of the town and the world beyond. They quickly gathered what they needed, finding a spot near the stone where the ritual could be performed. Lena's heart was pounding, but she focused on the task at hand. The markings on the stone were still faint, but they could be restored with the right materials. They had everything they needed: candles, the ancient symbols from the journals, and an offering to appease the beast, though Lena knew deep down that appeasing it would be impossible. They were not trying to make peace. They were trying to trap it once again. The lake continued to roar in the distance, its waves crashing against the shore as the creature surged closer. But Lena had no choice. She had to make this work, for all of them. The ritual began. Lena's hands trembled as she arranged the candles around the stone, the flickering light casting eerie shadows on the ground. The symbols on the stone, now clearer with the materials they had gathered, seemed to pulse with a faint, otherworldly energy, as though the stone itself were alive, waiting to be awakened. The creature's roars echoed through the trees, its massive form crashing through the woods in search of them. Each time it howled, the ground trembled, and the air grew colder, making it harder to breathe. The oppressive weight of the beast's presence pressed in on them, threatening to crush their will to continue. "Lena," Jacob said, his voice strained with panic, "we don't have much time. What are we doing exactly?" Lena turned to face him, her gaze steady despite the rising fear. "We're restoring the seal," she said firmly. "The ritual needs to be completed in a specific order. First, we restore the markings, then we make the offering, and finally, we must invoke the words of the original settlers." Amelia was already on her knees beside the stone, carefully tracing the symbols with a piece of charcoal. She looked up at Lena, her eyes wide. I don't understand. How do you know it'll work?" "I don't," Lena admitted, her voice tight. "But it's the only chance we have." The ground trembled again, and a wave of cold swept over them as the beast neared. The water of the lake churned violently now, as though it were trying to breach the shoreline, eager to unleash the horror from within its depths. Lena took a deep breath and focused. She could hear the rhythmic pounding of her heart, feel the trembling of the earth beneath her feet. The air crackled with unnatural energy as she stepped forward to join Amelia and Jacob, her gaze fixed on the stone. Elliot, who had been standing watch, his eyes darting nervously between the woods and the ritual, spoke up, his voice strained. "We need to hurry. It's close." Lena nodded, and with a steadying breath, she began to chant the ancient words she had read from the journal. The language was foreign, its syllables strange and heavy, but Lena didn't falter. She had practiced them over and over in her mind. This was their only hope. As she spoke, the air around them grew thick with energy, swirling and pulsing. The water of the lake began to subside, its violent ripples gradually smoothing out. For a moment, it seemed as though the ritual was working, that they might be able to turn the tide. But then the beast roared again, its sound deafening, and the ground beneath them shook violently. Suddenly, a shadow shot across the clearing, massive, dark, and monstrous. The creature's glowing eyes bore into them from the tree line, its form shifting like a nightmare made flesh. Lena's heart stopped in her chest. The beast was here, and it wasn't going to wait for them to finish. "Finish it," Jacob shouted. "We can't let it get any closer." With trembling hands, Lena grabbed the offering, the silver amulet they had found in the old records. It had been part of the original ritual, a symbol of protection, and it had to be placed in the center of the stone. But as she reached for it, the earth beneath her feet cracked open, and a forceful wind howled through the clearing, pushing her back. "Lena," Amelia cried, reaching out to her, but the wind knocked them both to the ground. The beast's form loomed ever closer. Its eyes glowed brighter now, filling the air with an oppressive light. Its growls were deep and guttural, like the earth itself was groaning in pain. "Hold the line," Lena shouted, struggling to her feet, her body aching from the wind's force. She grabbed the amulet and pressed it against the stone. The moment it touched the stone, a blinding flash of light erupted, and the beast let out a horrific, inhuman shriek. The ground shook violently, and the water of the lake swelled up, its waves crashing against the shore. For a moment, it seemed as though the world itself was unraveling. Lena's voice trembled as she finished the final words of the ritual. feeling the power of the stone pulsing beneath her fingers. The sky above darkened as though the sun itself was retreating, and the air grew thick with an eerie energy. And then suddenly everything went still. The wind died down. The ground stopped shaking. The water of the lake settled into an unnatural calm. Lena's heart raced in her chest as she looked up, her eyes wide with disbelief. The beast was gone, vanished. The lake surface was perfectly still, like nothing had ever happened. Did we do it? Jacob asked, his voice shaky with relief. Lena stepped back from the stone, her heart still pounding. I think so. It's over. But as the group gathered themselves, the unease still lingered in the air. They had sealed the creature, at least for now. But the knowledge of what lay beneath the water and what had been disturbed would never leave them. Lena turned to her friends, her face pale but resolute. It's not over forever, she said quietly. We've sealed it for now, but the lake will always remember. We have to make sure it never escapes again. The others nodded, their faces grim. They had survived, but they knew the truth. The silent lake was no place for anyone to linger. Its secrets were buried deep within its waters, and some things were better left undisturbed. Months passed, and life in the small town began to return to normal. The stories of the beast, of the strange happenings at the lake, faded into whispers, and the town's residents went about their daily lives, oblivious to the dark past that still lingered beneath the surface of the water. But for Lena and her friends, things had changed forever. They knew that the lake's curse was not something that could be easily erased. It would always be there, just below the surface, waiting for the moment when it could rise again. And so they kept watch, knowing that the silent lake would never truly be silent, and that the creature beneath the waters would never forget. It had been 6 months since the ritual. The town had returned to its mundane rhythm, as if the horrors of the past had been buried along with the creature in the silent lake. The roads had dried, the trees had reclaimed their fullness, and the sun even seemed to shine brighter on the small town that sat at the edge of the cursed water. But for Lena, Jacob, Amelia, and Elliot, the shadows lingered, clinging to their thoughts, their actions, an unspoken pact between them. Lena sat at her desk one quiet evening, the soft hum of a lamp providing the only sound in the room. Her fingers traced the edges of the journal she kept, the one that held all the knowledge they had gathered, all the rituals, the warnings, the markings. She could still feel the weight of the stone, the hum of ancient energy beneath her fingers as she pressed the amulet into place. It was a feeling she couldn't shake, the knowledge that the ritual had been temporary. A temporary fix. Amelia's voice broke the silence as she knocked on the doorframe, her face tense. Lena, we need to talk. Lena looked up, her heart skipping. She had been expecting this. The unease had been growing in Amelia's eyes for weeks. What's wrong? Amelia hesitated before stepping fully into the room, closing the door behind her. I don't think it's over. Lena's stomach tightened. What do you mean? I've been researching, Amelia said, pulling out a stack of old papers from her bag. The lake, the creature. Everything we thought we knew about the ritual, the seal. I'm starting to think it might not have been as permanent as we believed. Lena's breath hitched as she scanned the papers Amelia laid out on the table. There were sketches, diagrams of the stone, of the lake's geography, and, more concerning, the history of previous attempts to contain the creature. Amelia had found something that Lena hadn't. These records, Amelia said, pointing to an old account dated back to the early 1900s. They talk about how the seal was never meant to be permanent. The rituals failed, and the creature eventually broke free. Lena swallowed hard, leaning in. Are you saying that we haven't sealed it at all? I'm saying that we might have only delayed it, Amelia replied, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and resolve. Every few decades, the creature breaks through. It might take years, maybe decades, but it finds its way back. The lake isn't just a place. It's a trap, a prison for the creature, and the seal is. Fragile. It always has been. Lena felt her pulse race. She had been trying to push the nagging thought from her mind. A part of her had believed that if they did the ritual right, If they invoked the original words with the amulet, the beast would be bound forever. But Amelia's research was undeniable. This changes everything, Lena said, her voice quiet but firm. We thought we'd sealed it away for good, but maybe we only delayed it. Exactly, Amelia replied. We need to figure out a way to make it permanent, to end it once and for all. Lena's fingers clenched around the journal. The pages that had once brought her a sense of control now felt like a curse. She stared at the diagrams, the strange language that had once been just words, now laden with the weight of 1,000 unanswered questions. We need to go back, Lena said, a sudden clarity filling her mind. Back to the lake, the stone. If there's something we missed, something we didn't fully understand, we need to find it before it's too late. Amelia nodded, her eyes dark. Then we need to gather the others. It was late at night when Lena, Jacob, Amelia, and Elliot returned to the silent lake. The town was silent as they made their way through the woods, their flashlights cutting through the darkness like pale beacons. The air was thick with mist, the lake's black waters barely visible in the moonlight. It was too quiet, too still. There's no sign of the creature, Jacob said quietly, his voice low as they approached the clearing. Maybe we were wrong. Maybe it's really gone. Lena couldn't bring herself to believe that. The air, the water, it felt wrong. The lake wasn't just silent. It was holding its breath, waiting. Something was watching them. They reached the stone, the same one they had stood beside months ago. The markings had weathered more with time, but the energy in the air still crackled faintly. The seal, however, felt weaker than before. Lena could sense it like a pulse fading. We need to dig deeper, Lena said. I think there's something hidden beneath the stone. Elliot moved to the side, picking up a nearby rock. I'll help, he said, determination in his voice. Together, they pried at the stone, scraping away the vines and moss that had grown over it. As the last layers peeled away, Lena felt a chill run down her spine. Beneath the stone, there was an inscription, one that hadn't been visible before. Is that? Jacob started, his voice trailing off. Lena ran her fingers over the ancient symbols. It's a warning, she whispered. A deeper layer of the seal. We've been looking at the surface. This is what holds it in place. This was the part we didn't understand, Amelia said, kneeling beside Lena. The seal was never just about the stone. It's about the connection to the lake itself. Lena nodded. The lake. It's alive, and is trying to break free. She turned to the group. We need to perform the ritual again. But this time, we need to go deeper. We need to connect to the lake, to the water. It's the only way to strengthen the seal. Elliot looked uneasy, but nodded. We're ready. The wind picked up again, swirling through the trees like an omen. Lena took a deep breath and began to chant the ancient words once more. This time, as the words filled the air, something shifted in the water. The surface began to ripple. But this time, it wasn't the creature that emerged. A figure, human in shape, but pale, thin, and gaunt, rose slowly from the water, its eyes black as night. It wasn't the beast. It was something worse. The creature's source. The lake's true heart. Lena's heart raced. No, we've awakened it. The air thickened, the water rippling in unnatural patterns, as the figure slowly rose from the depths. It wasn't human, not really, but it had the shape of one. Its skin was stretched too tightly over its bones, its eyes dark pools of void. It moved with a slow, deliberate grace, each step on the water surface sending a ripple through the lake that seemed to vibrate with ancient power. Lena's breath hitched in her throat as she stepped back, the reality of the situation sinking in. This wasn't the creature they had faced before. It was something more primal, more ancient, something that had been locked away beneath the surface for centuries. What the hell is that? Jacob whispered, his voice trembling. He was barely able to take his eyes off the figure as it continued to rise, its silhouette becoming clearer against the dark water. Amelia's face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. That's not just a manifestation of the beast. That's something else, something deeper. It's the heart of the curse, the source. The figure's thin, skeletal hand extended, its fingers twitching with unnatural energy. As its hand moved, the water around it began to churn violently, as though the lake itself were alive. Lena could feel it, something terrible and ancient waking in the depths. "We need to stop it," she said, her voice firm despite the fear that gripped her. "This is what we missed before. This is what we need to seal away for good." The figure's eyes locked onto Lena, and for a moment, she felt a sharp, piercing cold, as though the creature was seeing directly into her soul. "You have disturbed the seal," a voice echoed, but it wasn't a voice they could hear with their ears. It was a deep, rumbling thought that crawled into their minds. "You have awakened me." Lena's heart pounded, her mind racing. "What are you?" she managed to choke out. "I am the water," the voice intoned, its tone like a low growl vibrating in their very bones. "I am the lake. I am the creature, the prison, and the keeper. I am the curse that has bound this land. And now, I am free." The figure's form seemed to ripple, distorting, becoming one with the water. It was both everywhere and nowhere at once, an inhuman entity made of the lake itself. Lena felt a rush of cold fear wash over her, but she forced herself to focus. She could still hear the chant in her mind, the words from the journal. They had to finish what they started, but this time, it wasn't just about the stone. The stone had been a part of the ritual, but the real power was in the water. "The ritual," Lena said, turning to Amelia. "We need to connect with the lake itself." Amelia nodded, her face grim. The stone was only the binding. "This," she gestured to the creature, now rising from the water, "is the key. We have to sever the connection." Lena took a deep breath, her pulse racing. She closed her eyes, focusing on the water in front of her. The words from the journal, the symbols they had found, all pointed to the same conclusion. They needed to bind the lake back, sever its connection to the earth, to the curse. But this time, they had to be more than just spectators. They had to become part of the ritual. Lena extended her hand toward the water, her fingers trembling as she whispered the ancient words. The wind howled around them, and the world seemed to pulse with the sound of the lake's heartbeat. The figure in the water jerked, as if struck by the chant, its movements becoming erratic. The lake's surface rippled, but the force of the energy pushing outward seemed to be pushing back against them, trying to stop the ritual. Jacob stepped forward, his face twisted in a mix of anger and fear. "We can't let it stop us." Amelia grabbed his arm. "Don't, Jacob. If we don't finish this, if we're not careful, it'll destroy us all." But it was too late. The figure in the lake let out a deafening, inhuman scream, its form expanding until it seemed to consume the entire surface. It wasn't just one being, it was everything. It was the lake, the beast, and the curse, all woven into one entity. A godlike being, ancient and primal, that had lived through the millennia. Suddenly, the ground beneath them trembled, and the water of the lake surged upward, threatening to swallow the entire clearing. The stone they had used to bind the beast cracked, splitting in two, and from the crack, an eerie light began to pour out, shimmering with unnatural energy. "No!" Lena shouted. "We're too late." But then, through the chaos, a voice rang out, a voice that was not their own, but familiar nonetheless. It was deep, resonant, and full of power. "Lena." Her heart skipped a beat. It was the creature's voice again, but it was different this time. It was speaking to her, speaking directly to her mind, as though it knew her. "Lena, you cannot stop me. You can never stop me. I am the lake. I am the curse. You are too late." The voice vibrated inside her head, as though it were tearing through her very thoughts. It was no longer just a creature. It was a force. And now, Lena realized with a cold sense of dread, it was not just the lake's curse. It was the essence of the land itself, a forgotten, older power than anything she had ever imagined. She closed her eyes, trying to concentrate, but the words of the chant, those final words they needed to speak, were slipping away from her. The ritual, the connection, everything was unraveling. And then she felt it, a sudden rush of cold, like ice water running through her veins. The lake had taken its final step to break free. The ground beneath them trembled violently, as though the very earth itself was being torn apart by the creature's awakening. Lena staggered, clutching onto Jacob as the ground cracked open in jagged lines, the water surging like a tidal wave ready to drown them all. The once silent, serene lake had become a boiling cauldron of terror. The wind howled in a chorus of anguished wails, the trees around them groaning in protest. The creature, no, the curse, had never been a simple beast. It was the very essence of the lake, the land's oldest spirit, and it was far more powerful than any of them had imagined. Lena's pulse raced as she tried to focus. The ritual. They had to finish the ritual. But the words, the ancient incantation that had worked before, were slipping from her mind like sand through her fingers. "Lena!" Jacob shouted, his voice barely audible above the roar of the water. He gripped her arm tightly, but she was already shaking her head. "The ritual won't work. We can't do it." Lena's heart pounded, the terror rising within her. She could feel the weight of the creature's presence pressing in on her. The cold was seeping into her bones. She could feel it in her very marrow. This was no ordinary curse. This was something older, something much older. "We have to try," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "If we don't, it will consume everything." Amelia's voice cracked through the chaos. "Lena, listen to me." She had come closer, her face pale and tense. "The lake, it's not just the creature. It's the source of the curse. The only way to stop it is to sever the connection to the land entirely." Lena's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" Amelia clenched her fists. "The creature, the curse, the lake itself, they are all bound to the land. The ritual you started, it can only work if we break that connection, if we sever the land from the lake itself. But we'll need to reach the very heart of the lake, and we'll need to give everything." Lena's mind whirled as she tried to process what Amelia was saying. The ritual had been about binding the beast, but this was something else entirely. Severing the connection. It was risky. It was dangerous. They could all die. But there was no time for hesitation. The water surged higher, and the figure, no, the curse, had become a roiling mass of shadows and energy, its form flickering in and out of existence like a nightmare. It loomed over them, its presence suffocating, and it was reaching for them. "Do it now," Elliot screamed. "We don't have much time." Lena nodded, her decision made. She turned to the others. "Amelia, Jacob, Elliot, hold on to each other. We need to bind ourselves to the lake, to its core. The power we used before won't be enough. We'll need to give everything." Amelia stepped forward, her expression determined. "We're ready." Lena took a deep breath, closing her eyes. The cold air cut through her like a blade, but she pushed the fear aside. She could feel the power in the earth beneath her feet, in the lake, in the air itself. It was all connected. She could feel the pulse of the curse, the very heart of the land, beating through her. And it was wrong. It was dying. It was suffocating everything it touched. The ritual words began to form in her mind. She opened her eyes, focusing on the lake's dark waters, now filled with swirling shadows. She began to speak, the ancient words flowing from her lips, each syllable cutting through the air like a blade. As the words echoed in the air, the lake began to respond. The water churned violently, surging upward, as if fighting against the ritual. But Lena held strong, focusing with every ounce of her will. The creature in the water let out an agonized roar, its form twisting and distorting as it fought against the power being used to bind it once again. The force of the curse pushed back against them, slamming into their minds, their hearts. But Lena didn't falter. She couldn't. "Now," she shouted at her friends, urging them to join in. Amelia, Jacob, and Elliot began chanting in unison with Lena, their voices trembling, but unwavering. The ground shook with the intensity of the ritual as the curse fought back harder, its wails filling the air. The figure in the lake screamed in fury, its form expanding and contracting, the water crashing against the shore in waves that threatened to overwhelm them. But they kept chanting. They kept going. Lena felt the pressure mounting, felt the curse pressing in on her, trying to break her, to pull her into the depths of the lake. But she held fast to the power that connected them all, the bond between them, the shared strength of their will. And then, with a deafening crash, the lake's waters seemed to freeze. Time itself seemed to stop, the water suspended in midair, the world holding its breath. The creature, no, the curse, let out one final, bone-chilling scream. The ground trembled beneath them, the air crackling with energy. The black water surged one last time, and then, suddenly, everything went still. A profound silence descended. The lake lay motionless. The air was thick with tension, but there was no movement, no creature, no terror. Lena collapsed to her knees, gasping for breath. Her limbs were trembling, her heart racing, but they had done it. They had severed the connection. "It's over," she whispered, looking up at her friends. But there was no joy in her voice, no relief, only exhaustion. Amelia stood beside her, her face pale but resolute. "Is it?" Lena's gaze flickered to the lake, the stillness of the water almost too calm. There was no creature, no curse, but the sense of something lingering, something ancient, was still there. The lake had been severed from the land, but had they truly destroyed the curse? Or had they only pushed it back for a while? The air grew colder. "We may have won the battle," Lena said slowly, "but the war is far from over." The silence stretched on, oppressive and unyielding. Lena, kneeling at the edge of the lake, felt an icy sensation crawl across her skin, the weight of the moment sinking in. The waters were still, but the eerie sense of something lingering was hard to shake. She had no words, no answers. The curse might have been severed from the land, but what they had just done, she couldn't be sure it was over. Amelia placed a hand on her shoulder, her grip firm yet gentle. "We can't let our guard down just yet. We don't know how far its reach extends." Lena nodded, trying to steady her breath, but the unease in her gut only grew stronger. She felt the eyes of the others on her, Jacob, Elliot, all of them silently watching. They had been through hell together. They had faced things no one else could imagine. And yet the realization dawned on Lena that even if the ritual had worked, the curse was not gone. It had only retreated into the shadows, waiting for another opportunity to rise. "We need to leave," Jacob finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "The lake is calm, but I don't trust it. Something is wrong here." Lena glanced up at him, nodding again. The air was too thick, and the very landscape around them seemed to vibrate with something ancient and powerful. Whatever they had done to break the connection, it was only a temporary fix. As they began to gather their belongings, Lena noticed the stone, the one they had used during the ritual, lying on the ground. The once glowing symbols were now dull and lifeless, as if drained of their power. But as she reached down to pick it up, a subtle shift in the air made her pause. The lake wasn't entirely still. It had stopped moving, yes, but the ripples, they were still there. Faint, unseen, undetected by the naked eye, but Lena could feel them deep in her chest. Lena stood up slowly, turning toward the others. They hadn't noticed yet. She could see the same weariness in their eyes, the same exhaustion that mirrored her own. But something inside her was telling her that leaving now wasn't the answer. They weren't done. They were only just beginning. Amelia caught her gaze. "What's wrong?" Lena bit her lip, eyes locked on the lake. It was calling to her again, but it wasn't like before. This time it was quieter, more insidious. A whisper that she couldn't escape, echoing in her bones. The lake's call was not simply the beast. It was something far deeper. "It's not over," Lena whispered, more to herself than to the others. "We need to go deeper, deeper." Jacob's voice was laced with disbelief. "Are you insane? We haven't finished the ritual," Lena interjected, cutting him off. "We only pushed it back. The curse was bound to the lake, but there's something else. Something we missed." Elliot frowned. "What do you mean?" Lena took a deep breath. "I think it's the lake itself. The curse is older than just the creature. It's tied to the very land, the water. We need to understand it, to sever it completely. Amelia's face was tight with concern. And how do you propose we do that? After everything we've already been through? Lena looked out at the lake, the horizon barely visible through the mist. The lake was not just a place. It was a conduit, a manifestation of something far older and darker than any of them had realized. The creature was just its physical manifestation. The real curse was deeper, tied to the very foundation of the land. I don't know, Lena admitted, but I have to try. I can feel it. There's something still here. Something we need to stop before it's too late. Jacob rubbed his face, exhausted. I don't think we have much time left. We need to get out of here before. The ground shook again. Lena didn't wait for the others. She started walking toward the water's edge, her feet moving instinctively as the earth beneath her shifted. The tremor grew stronger, and the very sky seemed to darken. The lake was stirring again, but this time, it wasn't the beast. It was something older, something that had been lying dormant beneath the surface. Lena, no? Amelia called after her. Lena's feet kept moving. She had to do this. She couldn't leave until she understood what they were dealing with. The others might have been ready to give up, but this wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about breaking the cycle, about destroying the curse for good. She reached the edge of the lake, the water's surface eerily still. The reflection of the trees above shimmered in the dark depths. But Lena knew better than to trust the surface. She could feel it, the power that still lingered. The curse was not just a creature, it was the land itself, feeding on the fear, the anguish that had been buried here for centuries. Lena reached into the pocket of her jacket and pulled out the journal, the one they had found in the abandoned cabin. The ancient words, the runes, they were all here. She flipped through the pages, trying to remember what they had missed, what they had failed to see. And then she found it. A final page, one they hadn't translated yet. Her heart skipped a beat. The symbols were foreign, but they were familiar. They matched the markings she had seen in the water. These weren't just incantations. They were instructions, rituals to open the very heart of the lake, to confront the source of the curse. Lena, please. Jacob's voice broke through her focus. You're going to get yourself killed. She turned to face them, her voice calm but unwavering. I can't leave. I won't. The air around her was electric, charged with the same energy that had filled the lake earlier. The power was building again, and this time, she knew they weren't just fighting a creature, they were fighting the very foundation of the curse itself. Lena turned back to the water, her voice steady as she began to chant the final incantation. The lake trembled, the ground shook, and the darkness beneath the water began to stir once more. Lena's breath caught in her chest as the water began to ripple beneath her feet. The air around her crackled with a familiar, oppressive energy, the kind that weighed on her very soul. The ground trembled again, and the trees around them began to sway in unnatural ways, their branches twisting like skeletal arms reaching out to grab her. The lake was alive with darkness. She had expected the curse to resist, to fight against her, but the way it stirred now was different. It wasn't just the creature, or the dark shape that had loomed beneath the surface. The curse itself, the entity, the force that had been growing for centuries, was waking. She could feel it in the very core of the earth beneath her, in the dark, cold waters that lapped at the shoreline. Lena clenched the journal tightly, the ancient script burning in her hands. Her voice trembled with both fear and determination as she spoke the final words from the page. She felt the power of the incantation surge through her, but it was only a fraction of what she knew they needed to confront. She had to reach deeper. The wind howled around her, whipping her hair back from her face as the curse reached up from the depths. She could hear the faintest whispers, words she couldn't understand, but that cut through the air like a sharp blade. Lena, Jacob's voice cracked through the chaos. You have to stop. We need to leave now. Lena shook her head, her gaze fixed on the lake. It's too late for that. We're already bound to this place. The only way out is through. Elliot stepped forward, his voice urgent. What are you talking about? There's no way we can. But before he could finish, the water surged upward in a violent explosion, sending a wall of black liquid crashing over the shoreline. The force of the wave knocked them all back, sending them sprawling to the ground. Lena barely managed to hold onto the journal as the world seemed to spin around her. From the depths of the lake, a massive shadow rose, taking shape before their eyes. It was more than a creature now. It was the embodiment of the curse, its true form. Dark tendrils of shadow reached out from the water, swirling around the group like serpents. Its shape was constantly shifting, flickering between forms, but its eyes, those glowing, malevolent eyes, remained constant, locked onto Lena as if it could see right through her. "No," she whispered, her heart pounding in her chest. "It's not just a creature. It's the curse itself. The lake. It's alive. The land is feeding it." The shadow loomed closer, its form growing larger with each passing second. Its whispers became louder, clearer, like voices echoing through her very mind. The curse wasn't trying to destroy them. It was trying to consume them, to break them down from the inside out, to turn their fear, their pain, into power. Lena took a step back, but her feet were rooted to the ground. The power of the lake, of the curse, was overwhelming, and she could feel it creeping into her thoughts. It was so easy to give into it, to let the fear wash over her, to let it swallow her whole. But she couldn't. She had to fight it. With a cry, Lena thrust the journal forward, speaking the final words of the incantation. She didn't know if it would work, if it would be enough to sever the connection completely, but she had no choice. The lake screamed in fury as the air around them thickened with energy. The ground shook violently, sending tremors through their bodies. The dark tendrils of shadow recoiled, writhing as though in pain. The water began to churn violently, its surface breaking apart, splintering into jagged shards. The curse was fighting back, but this time, it wasn't just the creature that resisted. It was the entire essence of the land, the very foundation that had kept the curse alive for so long. Lena could feel her heart racing as she pushed harder, willing the incantation to work. She felt a shift within the land itself, a deep, unsettling tremor that reverberated through her body. The lake's darkness began to pull back, the shadows shrinking, the whispers fading into silence. But then the earth beneath them cracked. The ground opened up, revealing a gaping chasm that seemed to descend into nothingness. The water surged downward, pouring into the abyss like a waterfall, pulling everything with it. The darkness rushed toward them like a tidal wave, and for a moment, Lena feared they would all be swept away into the depths. "Lena!" Jacob shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "We need to go. Now!" But Lena stood firm, the journal still clutched tightly in her hands. Her voice was strong, unwavering, as she finished the incantation. "I sever you. I cast you out." The words echoed through the air, and the world seemed to pause. The ground trembled one final time, and then the water rushed back into the chasm with a deafening roar. The shadow-like figure shrieked in agony, its form unraveling as the very foundation of the curse was torn apart. It was the end. The source of the evil was finally, irrevocably broken. And then silence. The water settled, the wind stopped howling, and the earth beneath them fell still. The tension in the air dissipated, leaving only the eerie calmness of the lake. It was over. The curse had been severed, its power broken, its hold on the land destroyed. Lena collapsed to her knees, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She could feel the weight of the ritual lift from her shoulders, but the exhaustion hit her all at once. She could barely hold herself up as she felt the presence of the others beside her, their hands on her arms, pulling her upright. We did it," Amelia whispered, her voice trembling. Lena nodded, though she wasn't sure if the question was for her or for all of them. "We did." But even as she said the words, a nagging thought lingered in the back of her mind. The curse had been powerful, ancient, but had they truly destroyed it? Or had they merely delayed its inevitable return? The air was still. The lake was calm. For now, it seemed peaceful. But deep beneath the surface, where the curse had once thrived, something still lingered, waiting. Lena sat on the edge of the now placid lake, her fingers tracing the cool surface of the water. It had stopped moving, stopped swirling with the darkness that had once held it captive. The faint morning light filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing, but the air felt eerily still. The tension that had gripped them all moments before was gone, at least on the surface. But Lena couldn't shake the feeling that the calm was an illusion, a brief respite before the inevitable. "I thought it would feel different," Jacob said, sitting beside her. His voice was quiet, almost contemplative. "It's too quiet. I thought. I don't know what I thought, but not this." Lena didn't answer immediately, her gaze fixed on the water. "We broke the curse," she said, but even she could hear the uncertainty in her own voice. "I think, but there's something still wrong here. Something we didn't quite finish." "What do you mean?" Jacob's eyes narrowed, concern deepening on his face. Lena stood up abruptly, her eyes darting around the clearing as if searching for something she couldn't quite see. She felt, watched. It wasn't like before, when the lake itself had seemed to have a mind of its own. But now, the forest felt heavy. The trees were too still, the silence too thick. "I don't know," she muttered. Something doesn't sit right." Amelia walked up beside them, her face pale and drawn from the ordeal. "You're right. It's too quiet. After everything we've been through, shouldn't there be more?" "I don't know, Release. Something to let us know it's really over." "I feel it too," Lena replied, her stomach twisting. She shook her head. "But the ritual, it should have worked. The curse should be gone." Elliot, who had been pacing anxiously, finally stopped and turned to face them. "Maybe it's just a shock. We've been through so much, and we're exhausted. This place, everything we've done, it's bound to take a toll." But his words didn't ease the unease gnawing at Lena's gut. The land might have been freed of the curse, but something still lingered. The curse wasn't just a creature or an evil force. It was part of the land itself. And she couldn't help but wonder, had they severed its connection completely? Or had they only sealed it away for a time, burying it deeper beneath the surface? "Maybe we should get out of here," Jacob suggested, standing up. "Leave while we still can." Lena's eyes flicked back to the water, her mind racing. As much as she wanted to leave, to put all of this behind her, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Not by the curse, not by the creature, but by something else. Something much older. "Wait," she said suddenly, holding up a hand. "There's something in the trees." The others turned toward her, their expressions a mix of confusion and concern. "What do you mean?" Amelia asked. Lena didn't answer immediately. She could feel the weight of the forest pressing in on her, its shadows shifting just at the edge of her vision. She felt a coldness creeping up her spine, a sharp, biting sensation that had nothing to do with the weather. And then she saw it, a movement in the trees. It was quick, almost imperceptible, a flicker of shadow, just out of reach, a figure that seemed to blend into the foliage like a phantom. She could barely make out its shape, but it was there, watching. "Did you see that?" she whispered, her voice shaky. Jacob's face twisted in disbelief. "What? Where?" But when he turned to look, the movement was gone. The forest was still once more, its eerie quiet broken only by the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. "I don't know," Lena said, her voice low. "I saw something, a figure, in the trees." "I didn't see anything," Jacob replied, his eyes scanning the forest. "Are you sure I saw it," she interrupted, her heart pounding in her chest. "It was right there, I swear." Amelia stepped forward cautiously, her eyes narrowing. "Lena, are you sure? Maybe it's just the aftermath of everything we've been through. The stress, the fear, we're all..." But before she could finish, a sound cut through the silence, a soft, distant whisper, barely audible, yet unmistakable. It was a voice. No, several voices. "Lena." It hissed. Her breath hitched in her throat. The sound was so faint, so indistinct, but it was unmistakable. It was calling her name. "It's not over," Lena whispered, a chill spreading through her limbs. "It's still here." Elliot frowned, his brows furrowing with confusion. "What are you talking about? There's nothing." "No," Lena interjected, taking a step back, her gaze fixed on the trees. "It's here. Whatever we did to break the curse, it wasn't enough." The wind picked up again, howling through the clearing, sending leaves swirling into the air. The atmosphere around them shifted, as if the land itself was reacting to something unseen, something that had been disturbed. Jacob reached for Lena's arm, his grip firm. "We need to leave. Now." But Lena shook her head, her eyes wild with panic. "It's not safe to leave yet. We haven't finished what we started." Amelia's voice was barely a whisper. "Lena, what are you saying?" The figure appeared again. This time, it was closer, its outline faint, like a ghost that couldn't quite materialize fully. It was watching them, its presence filling the air like a suffocating force. The eyes, Lena realized, were glowing, bright and unnatural, piercing through the darkness of the trees. "I think it's the land," Lena said, her voice shaking. "It's not just a curse. We've severed the creature, but the curse is still bound to the land. The trees, the lake, everything around us. It's all connected." The figure took another step forward, its movements slow and deliberate, like a predator closing in on its prey. And then a deep, bone-chilling growl echoed through the woods. Lena's heart skipped a beat. It was coming. The source of the curse wasn't gone. It was just waiting to make its move. "We're not done yet," Lena whispered, backing away slowly. "We need to finish what we started. We need to destroy the land itself." Jacob's face paled as the growl grew louder, closer. "What do you mean? How?" Lena's eyes were wide with realization. "We have to break the bond between the curse and the land. Only then will it end." The forest around them seemed to breathe with anticipation, the shadows swirling, the trees creaking as though they were waking up from a long, forgotten slumber. The land was calling to them, drawing them in, and they had to stop it before it consumed them all. The growl echoed once more, louder this time. The sound wasn't just a noise. It felt like a vibration that rattled through their bones. The figure in the trees was no longer just a shadow. Its eyes glowed brighter, the outline of its body taking a more solid form. Lena could see the twisted shape of a face, its features barely discernible, but filled with an unnatural, malevolent energy. The trees around them seemed to pulse, as though they were alive, drawing strength from the dark figure. "What is that?" Amelia gasped, her voice shaking as she backed away, her eyes wide with fear. "That's it," Lena breathed. "The land, the curse, it's all one thing. The creature, the forest, the lake. It's all part of this place. If we want to end it, we have to sever it completely." "We need to leave," Jacob said, his voice urgent, his eyes never leaving the figure. "It's too dangerous. We're not strong enough for this." Lena turned to face him, her own fear mirrored in his eyes, but her resolve hardened. "We don't have a choice. If we run, it won't stop. The curse will never end. It'll only grow stronger, and this place will swallow everything in its path." Elliot swallowed hard, looking around nervously. "But how do we sever the connection? You said the land is tied to it. How do we stop something like that?" Lena's heart raced. She had the answer, the way to sever the bond. But it would be dangerous, risky. She wasn't sure they were strong enough for it. "There's an altar," Lena said slowly, her mind racing. "I've read about it in the journal. There's an altar hidden somewhere in the woods, where the curse is the strongest. If we can destroy it, destroy the source of the curse, the land will be free. The creature won't have anywhere to draw its power from anymore." "But how do we find it?" Jacob asked, his voice tight with urgency. "We don't even know where it is." Lena bit her lip, feeling the weight of her own uncertainty. "We'll have to find it. The altar is linked to the land's heart, the place where the curse began. It's hidden deep in the forest, near the oldest tree. If we can reach it before the creature, before the land, overpowers us, Her voice trailed off. It was a gamble. The curse had already shown them just how powerful it could be. But there was no other option. They had to try. "Let's go," Jacob said, his expression hardening with resolve. "We have no choice." Together, they moved toward the heart of the forest, pushing past the trees that seemed to close in on them like walls. The path grew more difficult, the earth underfoot shifting as though the forest itself was trying to resist them. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of damp soil and decay. The sounds of the woods were strange now, distorted, as if the forest itself was alive, whispering in voices Lena couldn't understand. The growl came again, louder, more menacing. It was behind them now, just out of sight, but the oppressive weight of its presence was palpable, pressing against them like an invisible hand. Lena pushed forward, determination in her steps. They had to make it to the altar before the curse consumed them. They had no other option. After what felt like hours, they reached a clearing. The trees around them were twisted and gnarled, their trunks dark and almost blackened, as though the curse had seeped into their very fibers. At the center of the clearing stood the oldest tree Lena had ever seen. Its bark was twisted in strange patterns, its roots curling and burrowing into the earth like living veins. "That's it," Lena whispered, her voice hoarse. "The altar is near here. We need to find it." The air around them shifted once more. The land felt colder, the shadows deeper. It was as if the very earth was aware of their presence and didn't want them here. The trees seemed to groan as they bent under some unseen weight. Jacob turned to Lena, his face pale. "We need to hurry." But before they could move, the growl rose again, louder, more vicious this time. The figure from the trees was closer now, emerging from the darkness. It wasn't just one figure anymore. There were many shadowy forms that moved just beyond the range of their sight. The trees shifted as if giving way to the cursed presence, and Lena knew, deep down, they were running out of time. "We can't outrun it," Lena said, breath coming in ragged gasps. "We need to get to the altar. We need to destroy it." She stepped forward, her hands shaking as she approached the massive tree at the center of the clearing. The bark was cold to the touch, smooth yet marked with deep ridges that felt almost like writing. She ran her fingers along it, feeling the strange vibrations under the surface. And then she saw it. Beneath the tree, half buried in the soil, was a stone slab, engraved with runes and symbols she recognized from the journal. This was the altar, the source of the curse, the heart of it all. But before she could move, the ground beneath them shifted. The creatures from the trees emerged fully, their dark forms coalescing into shapes that were almost human, tall and gaunt with glowing eyes, their faces twisted in agony. The ground cracked open beneath them as the land itself rose up, the earth writhing like it was alive. Lena's heart pounded as she felt the weight of the curse pressing against her, trying to break her will. She could hear the whispers again, distant but close, threatening. But she refused to give in. This was the moment, the only chance to end it all. With a sharp cry, Lena dropped to her knees, pressing her hands to the stone slab. She muttered the words from the journal, her voice low but steady. The runes on the stone began to glow, pulsing in time with her words. The earth trembled as the power of the curse fought back, the creatures howling as they surrounded her. "Lena!" Jacob shouted, reaching for her. But Lena didn't look up. She had to finish it. She had to. The stone began to crack as the energy surged. The earth groaned in protest, but Lena didn't stop. With a final shout, she pressed her palms harder into the stone, the runes glowing brighter. The creatures shrieked in pain, their forms distorting as the curse fought to maintain its hold. And then, with one final, resounding crack, the stone shattered. A deafening silence followed. The land froze. The curse was gone. For a long moment, there was nothing. The earth beneath Lena's hands felt eerily still, the air thick with tension. Her heart was pounding in her chest, and her breath came in ragged gasps. She slowly pulled her hands away from the shattered stone, feeling the weight of exhaustion settle over her like a blanket. The oppressive darkness had lifted, but something in the air still felt off. Behind her, the creatures that had once been circling them were now gone, their forms dissipating like mist. The shrieks, the growls, the whispers, they were all silent now. Jacob rushed to Lena's side, his hand on her shoulder. Did we do it? Lena nodded weakly. I think so. The curse, it's broken. The altar, we destroyed it. But as they stood there in the clearing, Lena couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The forest had grown unnervingly quiet. The usual sounds of wind rustling through the trees or distant animal calls were absent. It felt like the world had held its breath, waiting for something that was now forever changed. We should go, Jacob said, his voice low, before anything else happens. Lena didn't argue. She could feel the pull to leave this cursed place, the need to return to something familiar, to something safe. Together, they turned toward the edge of the clearing, the path they had come from now obscured by the dense woods. The trees, which had seemed so threatening just moments before, were now still, their twisted forms barely noticeable in the dim light. But as they began walking, the sense of unease didn't dissipate. It lingered, hanging over them like a dark cloud. Do you think it'll stay gone? Amelia asked, looking nervously over her shoulder as they walked. Lena wasn't sure how to answer. The ritual had worked, the altar was destroyed, and the curse had been severed. But as they moved deeper into the forest, there was an eerie sense that the land had become something else, something undefined. The silence, once a relief, now felt like a warning. We've done everything we could, Lena said quietly, but I don't think we'll ever really know if it's over. The forest, it was more than just a place. It was tied to something much darker. And when something that powerful is broken, there's always a price. The others exchanged uneasy glances, but none of them spoke. The tension in the air was thick, and every footstep seemed to echo too loudly in the quiet woods. It felt like something was watching them. By the time they reached the outskirts of the forest, the first rays of dawn were breaking through the trees, casting pale light on the ground below. The oppressive darkness that had once cloaked the woods had lifted, but it wasn't the bright, welcoming morning they had hoped for. It was as if the very land itself was still recovering from the curse that had held it in its grip for so long. Lena's legs felt heavy, as though the weight of the curse had drained all the energy from her body. She wanted to collapse, but she knew they weren't safe yet. Not until they were clear of the woods entirely. The others were quiet, each of them absorbed in their own thoughts as they walked in a loose formation. Jacob kept his hand close to Lena's, a silent reassurance that they were still together, still alive. Amelia was scanning the forest around them, her eyes constantly shifting from one shadow to the next. Elliot kept a few steps ahead, clearly eager to leave, but there was a wariness in his movements, as if he wasn't sure if the danger was really gone. Finally, they reached the edge of the woods, the boundary where the forest began to thin out, and the wildness gave way to the distant hum of civilization. Lena stopped, her gaze lingering on the trees one last time. The lake was no longer visible through the branches, but she could feel it in her bones. Its still waters had been the heart of the curse, and the heart had now been silenced. But she couldn't ignore the gnawing sensation that something was still wrong. Is it really over? Jacob asked, his voice low. Lena didn't have an answer for him. She could only shake her head, feeling a mixture of relief and doubt twist within her. They had severed the connection, but was that enough? Had they truly ended the curse, or had they only postponed its inevitable return? Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the trees behind them. Everyone froze. Lena's heart skipped a beat. What was that? They all turned to look, the air seeming to tighten around them. For a moment, nothing moved. No shadows shifted. No wind stirred the leaves. Then, with a deep, guttural sound, the ground trembled beneath their feet. Lena's pulse quickened. Get back, she shouted, her voice rising in panic. We need to move now. But it was too late. From the darkness of the forest, a figure emerged, larger this time, its form twisted and more solid than before. The shape of it was almost human, but its limbs were impossibly long, its skin mottled with patches of bark-like texture, its eyes glowing with an eerie red light fixed on them. A low, guttural growl vibrated through the air, louder than before. The creature was no longer a shadow. It was something tangible, something real. But it was different. It was no longer bound by the curse. The ground around it cracked, and from the fissures rose more shadows, more figures, smaller, but still filled with that same malevolent energy. The land was not done with them. The creature's lips peeled back into a twisted grin. It was no longer a force of nature bound to the land. It was a predator, and they were its prey. Lena's stomach churned with dread as the realization hit her. The curse had never been just a curse. It had been a warning. The creature took a slow step forward, its eyes never leaving Lena and the others. The growl emanating from its chest was deeper, more guttural, a sound that seemed to shake the very air around them. The trees around the clearing creaked as if responding to its presence. The darkness that had once plagued the forest seemed to be returning, crawling back from the cracks in the ground, wrapping itself around the trunks of the trees and pooling in the shadows. Lena's heart raced. We need to run," she shouted, but her voice felt hollow, drowned out by the oppressive hum of the creature's growls. It was too late to flee. The ground beneath them trembled again, as though the very earth had been disturbed by the awakening of something ancient. The forest, the curse, it was alive and it was angry. Amelia grabbed Lena's arm, her face pale. "What is it? What happened? We broke the curse." Lena's mind raced. They had destroyed the altar, severed the bond between the creature and the land. The curse should have been gone, but now this. This thing before them, this monster, it felt different. It didn't feel like the forest was bound to it anymore. It was free. The creature snarled, its elongated fingers curling into claws as it lunged forward with terrifying speed. It wasn't just a creature of the curse anymore. It was something more, a predator born from the twisted land that had long been dormant, waiting for the curse to be broken so it could rise again. Lena barely had time to react. She pulled Amelia back as the creature's claws swiped at the air, narrowly missing them. The others scattered, but the creature's red eyes tracked their every movement, its form too fast, too powerful to outrun. "We need to fight it," Jacob shouted, grabbing a branch from the ground and swinging it at the creature. The creature didn't flinch. Instead, it batted the branch away with one swift motion, its growl vibrating through the ground. The air grew thick with dread, as if every breath was a struggle. It was impossible to escape, impossible to hide. The woods were closing in again, a claustrophobic, suffocating force. Lena felt her own panic rising, but she held it back. This wasn't the time to give in. They had to finish what they started, had to end this. There had to be another way. "There's got to be something we missed," Lena muttered, her mind racing. "The journal. There has to be something." Her eyes widened as she remembered one last part of the ritual, one part she had been too afraid to acknowledge. "The creature," she whispered. "It's not just tied to the land. It's the land itself. It was born from the curse, but it was also formed by the land. If the curse is broken, it could still linger unless we bind it somewhere. We need to trap it again." "But how?" Jacob shouted. "We're not prepared for this. We didn't come with weapons or anything to fight it." Lena's mind raced. She thought back to the journal. What had it said? The altar, the stones, the runes. There was a way to bind it, a way to weaken it. But she would need the right tools, the right place. "The lake," she said suddenly, her voice full of urgency. "It was the source, the heart of the curse. If we can get to the lake, maybe we can trap it there before it can fully escape." "There's no time," Amelia cried. "It's too strong. We can't outrun it to the lake." "We don't have a choice," Lena replied, turning to face the creature as it took another step forward, its claws reaching out. "We need to get to the water. Now!" Without waiting for further protest, Lena sprinted toward the trees, moving faster than she thought she could, her legs burning as the ground seemed to shift under her feet. She heard the others running behind her, their footsteps heavy with fear, but Lena didn't dare look back. The creature was relentless. The woods closed in tighter as they ran, the air growing colder, the shadows growing deeper. The closer they got to the lake, the more Lena could feel the pull of the curse of the land. It was like something inside her was awakening, too, guiding her to the water. But as they neared the shore, Lena's heart sank. The lake was still too still. The waters, once a dark reflection of the cursed land, now looked like a mirror to the heavens above. Yet something was wrong. The surface wasn't just a reflection. It felt like a trap, a dark void that beckoned with an ancient hunger. The creature was close now, its growls echoing from behind them. It had caught up. "Lena!" Jacob shouted, his breath ragged as he skidded to a stop beside her. "What do we do? There's no time left." Lena knelt down by the edge of the lake, her hands trembling as she reached into the soil, digging frantically. The journal had said something about using the land's energy to trap the creature, but she wasn't sure how. Suddenly, a strange pull took hold of her chest. The land was calling to her. With her heart in her throat, Lena pressed her palms flat against the ground. The runes she had seen before, the ones etched into the altar, began to glow faintly beneath her touch. The earth hummed, a deep vibration that seemed to synchronize with her heartbeat. And then the lake responded. The surface of the water rippled as something began to stir beneath it. The pull grew stronger, the darkness of the lake drawing in around them like a vortex. The creature, sensing its fate, let out a terrible shriek as it lunged toward them. But Lena was ready. She whispered the incantation from the journal, her voice trembling but unwavering. As she spoke the final word, the ground beneath her cracked open, and the lake erupted. Dark tendrils of energy shot from the water, wrapping around the creature, pulling it toward the lake. It howled in desperation, its body contorting as it tried to resist, but the pull was too strong. The shadows around it dissolved as it was drawn into the water, its glowing red eyes the last thing visible before it disappeared beneath the surface. The lake stilled once more. Silence. The curse was broken, but Lena could feel the weight of it still hanging in the air. The battle had been won, but at what cost? The silence that followed was unsettling. The lake's still surface shimmered in the early morning light, no longer reflecting the oppressive darkness that had once clung to the land. It was as if the world had paused for a brief moment, holding its breath. Lena sat back on the damp earth, her hands still trembling from the ritual. She could feel the heat from the ground beneath her, but her body was cold. The realization that the creature was gone, a fleeting shadow of what had once been a terrifying force, didn't bring her the relief she expected. Instead, it felt like the calm before the storm, a tense stillness that pressed against her chest. Jacob crouched beside her, his expression grim. Is it really over? Lena looked up at him, her eyes heavy with doubt. I don't know. The curse has been broken, but the creature's gone, Jacob interrupted, his voice a little too hopeful. That's what matters, right? We did it. We stopped it. Maybe, Lena whispered, her gaze fixed on the lake. But I can still feel it, the energy here. It's like the land is shifting. It doesn't feel like it's completely gone. Amelia and Ellie had finally reached them, breathless and wide-eyed. They had watched the spectacle of the lake erupting, but the realization hadn't yet settled in. It hadn't been a victory. It had been an escape. What do we do now? Amelia asked, her voice small but steady. She kept glancing back at the lake, as though expecting the creature to rise from the depths at any moment. We leave, Lena replied softly, rising to her feet. We leave, and we never come back here. This place, it's too dangerous. She turned, glancing at her friends, who all looked back at her with a mix of relief and uncertainty. They were alive, and the creature was gone, but they hadn't won in the way they had hoped. The curse had been a force of nature, a darkness bound to the earth itself. Could they really be sure it was gone? Or had they merely trapped it again, hidden deep beneath the lake's surface? Lena, Jacob began cautiously. What do you mean? Are you saying we can't ever come back to the lake? What if it's truly gone? Lena shook her head, the words thick on her tongue. I don't know what's left. I can feel it, the land, it's like it's still in pain. Maybe it's gone, maybe it's not. But either way, we don't know. What'll happen? The curse is not just broken, it's changed something. I can feel it, Jacob. I think we've done what we needed to, but it's not over in the way we thought. Elliot stepped closer, his eyes narrowed. So, we're just gonna walk away? Yes, Lena said firmly. We walk away. We leave it behind. We have to. For a moment, none of them spoke. The air was thick with questions, with uncertainty. But in the end, there was no other choice. The land had its secrets, and they weren't meant to uncover them. The journey back to the town was uneventful, the tension hanging over them like a fog. As they made their way through the forest, there was a sense of finality to their steps, each one carrying them farther away from the place that had haunted their every waking moment. They didn't speak much, save for brief exchanges, as if trying to avoid the weight of the questions that lingered in their minds. The trees slowly thinned, and the edges of the forest began to fade. The road ahead stretched long and winding, the small town barely visible in the distance. The morning sun was now fully up, casting a warm, golden light over the world, almost too serene, as if the horrors of the past few days had been a dream. But Lena knew better. She could feel it still, deep inside her. A tug, a weight, a darkness that clung to her thoughts like a shadow that couldn't be shaken off. As they approached the town, the others seemed to relax, their shoulders easing as they looked forward to the comfort of familiar surroundings. But Lena remained silent, her mind racing. Jacob noticed her expression and slowed his pace to walk beside her. You're still thinking about it, aren't you? He asked softly. Lena nodded. I can't help it. Something's not right. I know we stopped the creature. I know we stopped the curse, but that doesn't mean everything's gone. This place, it's alive in ways we don't understand. The land, the lake, the energy, it's like it's been left to heal, but there's something else. Do you think the creature will come back? Jacob asked, his voice tinged with concern. I don't know, she replied quietly, but I don't think it's over. Whatever we did, whatever we broke, it's not something that can be undone. Not easily. The land feels different now, but not better. It's like it's waiting for something. They reached the edge of the town, the familiar streets in sight, but Lena couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't escaped. Not really. The curse had been a part of this place for so long, and even if they had severed its most obvious form, there was still something more hidden beneath the surface. The others had fallen behind, but they too seemed uneasy. Amelia caught up with them, her face pale. I keep thinking about the lake, she said, her voice soft but shaken. Do you think it could ever come back? I don't know, Lena admitted, but I think we've done all we can. We have to live with what we've done and pray that it's enough. The walk back to the town felt like a long road to nowhere. The familiar buildings, the bustling streets, everything seemed unchanged, as if the past few days had been some kind of nightmare that no one else had experienced. And yet, the weight of the land, the curse, and the creature still hung in the air. As they neared the town center, Lena stopped, turning one last time to look at the forest in the distance. The trees seemed to stare back at her, tall and unyielding, as if daring her to return. She couldn't. She wouldn't. But as the sun dipped lower in the sky, the fading light cast long shadows across the town. And for the briefest of moments, Lena thought she saw something in those shadows, something shifting, moving just out of the corner of her eye. Her breath caught in her throat. It was just a trick of the light. It had to be, but in the deepest corner of her mind, she couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't. Lena couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The days that followed their return to town were unsettlingly normal. The townspeople seemed oblivious to the horrors they had faced, going about their lives as though nothing had changed. It made sense. No one else had seen what they had. But for Lena and her friends, it felt impossible to forget the weight of what they had left behind. The forest, the curse, and the creature, none of it seemed finished. It was as though a storm was brewing, waiting for its moment. Lena couldn't sleep. Every night, her dreams were haunted by the same images, the creature's red eyes, the lake's still surface, the rumbling earth. She would wake in a cold sweat, her heart pounding, unable to shake the sensation that something was watching her. One evening, she stood at her window, staring out at the town. The streets were quiet, the dimming light casting long shadows across the buildings. The world outside seemed peaceful, almost idyllic. Yet something gnawed at her, like a dull ache in her chest that wouldn't go away. "Lena," Jacob's voice interrupted her thoughts. She turned to see him standing in the doorway, his expression drawn tight with concern. "You're still thinking about it, aren't you?" Lena nodded slowly, her eyes returning to the streets outside. "I can't help it. There's something about this place. Something isn't right. I thought if we left, it would go away, but it hasn't." Jacob stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. "We've done everything we could. The creature's gone. The curse is broken. I don't think there's anything more we can do." "You're right," Lena said quietly, though she didn't feel convinced. "But I feel like it's waiting, like it's just biding its time." The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken fears. Lena could see the uncertainty in Jacob's eyes. He wanted to believe, wanted to think that everything was finally over, but the same doubt lingered in him as it did in her. They couldn't escape the feeling that something was still out there. "Maybe we need to talk to someone," Jacob suggested after a long pause. "Maybe there's something we missed. Maybe someone here knows more about the land, about the curse." Lena considered this, her mind racing through possibilities. Who could we even talk to? Who in this town would know anything about it? Everyone just goes on with their lives like nothing ever happened. "There's one person," Jacob said quietly, "that I've heard about. An old woman. She lives on the outskirts of town, up by the hills. Some say she knows things about the land. Maybe she can help." Lena hesitated, unsure. "I don't know. If she knows something, it's better we stay away from it. What if we just let it be?" "Lena," Jacob pressed, stepping closer to her. "We need to know. We need to be sure. If there's even a chance that something's still out there, we have to stop it now." Lena looked at him for a long moment, then sighed in resignation. "All right, let's go. But if this woman is just another legend, then we're done. No more." Jacob nodded, a glimmer of hope flashing in his eyes. "Agreed. But if she knows something, we need to find out. It's the only way we'll know for sure." The journey to the outskirts of town was eerie in itself. The path that led into the hills was overgrown and narrow, winding through dense woods that seemed to grow darker with each step. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the only light now came from the distant stars and the dim glow of the lantern Jacob carried. The further they walked, the more Lena's sense of unease grew. The air here felt different, heavier, colder. It was like they were entering another world entirely, a world that had no connection to the life they had left behind. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a small, weathered cabin tucked among the trees. It looked as if it had been standing for centuries, its wooden frame bent and sagging with age. The window panes were cracked, and the door hung slightly ajar, as though expecting them. Lena hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. "Are you sure about this?" Jacob glanced at her, his expression resolute. "We need answers." They walked up to the door, and Jacob knocked gently. The sound echoed into the night, bouncing off the trees. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, a soft voice, faint and gravelly, called from within. "Come in." Lena's blood ran cold, but she stepped inside, her pulse quickening with each step. The cabin was dimly lit by a single, flickering candle. Shadows clung to the walls, and the air inside smelled of herbs and earth. An elderly woman sat at a table in the center of the room. Her hair was long and white, tangled like the roots of the trees outside. Her skin was pale, wrinkled with age, and her eyes, dark and intense, seemed to pierce through Lena as if she could see straight into her soul. "You've come," the woman said, her voice like the wind rustling through dead leaves. "I knew you would." Lena took a cautious step forward. "You know why we're here?" The woman nodded slowly, her fingers trembling as she reached for a cup of tea on the table. "I've been waiting for you. The land calls to those who understand it, and you child, are one of those who can hear its voice. Do you know what happened? Jacob asked, his voice tight with anxiety. About the creature in the lake? The curse? The woman's eyes darkened. I know much about this land, more than any here would care to remember. But not everything can be told in words. Some things you must feel. Some things you must see for yourself. Lena felt a chill run down her spine. What do you mean? The woman looked at her, a knowing glint in her eyes. The curse was never truly broken. It was only delayed. The creature, the darkness, is a part of this land, just as much as the trees and the lake. It will never go away, not entirely. It is waiting, and soon it will rise again. Lena's breath caught in her throat. No, we stopped it. We broke the curse. We saw it disappear into the lake. It's gone. The woman's lips curled into a thin smile. You may have sealed it for now, but there are forces that cannot be contained forever. The lake is only the beginning, child. It is the heart of this place, and it beats in time with the land itself. It will find a way to return. Lena felt the weight of the woman's words sink into her chest like a stone. It was true, what she had feared. This wasn't over. The woman's words echoed in Lena's mind as they left the cabin, her feet moving almost instinctively along the narrow, winding path. The weight of what they'd learned settled over her, cold and suffocating. She felt like she was drowning in it, suffocated by the knowledge that they had not escaped the curse. Jacob walked beside her in silence, his face drawn, as if the same realization was settling within him. Neither of them spoke, the chill of the night air only adding to the growing sense of unease that pressed against them from all sides. When they finally reached the town, Lena didn't feel the relief she had expected. The streets were quiet, almost too quiet. The usual hum of town life, the chatter of late-night conversations, the occasional car passing by, it was all absent. The air felt stifling, like the calm before a storm. Do you think she's right? Jacob's voice broke the silence. His question hung in the air, heavy and uncertain. I don't know, Lena said, her throat tight. I don't want to believe it, but she's the only one who knew. There's no way she could have guessed everything we've seen. Jacob nodded slowly, his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets. But we stopped the creature, right? We sealed it away. We thought we did, Lena whispered. But I don't think it's gone. Not really. As they made their way toward the edge of the town, a sense of dread began to settle in. The familiar buildings and streets now seemed foreign, distant. The feeling of being watched, the strange pull that had drawn them toward the woods in the first place, was creeping up again. Lena stopped in her tracks. Jacob, I have to go back. He turned to her, confusion in his eyes. What? No, we've done enough. We can't go back there, Lena. I have to, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The lake is calling me. I need to understand what's happening. Jacob hesitated, and for a moment, Lena wasn't sure if he would agree. But then, with a heavy sigh, he nodded. All right, but we do this together. No more going off alone. We'll figure this out, whatever it takes. They set off once more, back through the woods, the path familiar, but infinitely darker than it had been before. The trees seemed to close in around them, their gnarled limbs twisting in strange, unnatural ways. The lake was ahead, still and silent, just as it had been when they first arrived. But now, with the weight of the woman's words heavy on their hearts, it seemed impossibly ominous. The shoreline was eerily quiet, and yet Lena couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking beneath the surface, waiting. We shouldn't be here, Jacob muttered, his voice barely audible. Lena turned to him, but before she could respond, a soft, distant sound reached her ears. It was faint, but unmistakable, a whisper calling her name. She froze. The whisper came again, louder this time. Lena! Her heart pounded in her chest as she stepped closer to the water, her feet moving on their own accord. She could feel the pull, an irresistible force that made it impossible to look away. The lake, the curse, it was all here. Everything they had tried to escape, everything they had hoped to leave behind, was right in front of them. Lena, don't. Jacob grabbed her arm, pulling her back with surprising force. This isn't real. It's the curse. It's messing with your head. But Lena's gaze was fixed on the water, her breath shallow as she slowly knelt at the edge of the lake. She could feel the darkness beneath the surface, could almost hear it calling to her, urging her to listen. And then, just as her fingers brushed the water's surface, the world around them began to change. The ground trembled beneath their feet, a low rumble like distant thunder that sent ripples across the water. The trees shook violently, their branches twisting and bending unnaturally, as if something was waking from deep within the earth itself. Lena gasped, pulling her hand back from the water as the darkness below the surface seemed to stir. The lake began to churn, the water swirling as if something massive was rising from the depths. No, no, no! Jacob shouted, grabbing Lena's arm and pulling her back. But the force of the tremor was too strong, and they both stumbled, nearly falling as the earth beneath them cracked open. A deafening roar split the air, and out of the lake, something monstrous began to emerge. It was massive, its form barely visible as it rose from the water, a hulking mass of shadow and terror. Its eyes glowed red, and a thick, gnarled shape that could have been a claw shot from the depths, splintering the ground as it swiped toward them. Lena's heart raced, her thoughts racing. The creature, the same one they had fought before, it had returned, and now it was more powerful than ever. We have to stop it, Lena screamed, pulling away from Jacob's grip and running toward the shoreline. But there was nowhere to run. The creature's glowing eyes locked onto her, and for a moment, she felt herself drawn into them, lost in the darkness. It was as though the creature could see into her very soul, feeding off her fear, feeding off her helplessness. Jacob grabbed her just in time, pulling her back. Lena, we need to go. Now! But Lena was already running toward the water again, her feet moving faster, driven by some unseen force. She knew that if she didn't stop this now, if she didn't finish it once and for all, there would be no escape. The roar of the creature shook the night air, louder now, and the ground beneath them cracked wider, the earth itself splitting open as the creature began to rise fully from the lake. Its enormous form towered over them, casting an eerie shadow over the entire landscape. Lena, Jacob's voice was full of desperation, but it barely registered in her mind. All she could see now was the creature, the beast beneath. The battle was just beginning. The creature loomed before them, its massive form shuddering as it emerged from the lake. Its eyes, two glowing red orbs, burned with an unearthly hunger, scanning the land as it rose from the water, the air thick with the scent of decay and the earth splitting under its weight. Lena felt the force of its presence like a crushing weight on her chest, making it hard to breathe. We have to do something. Jacob's voice was urgent, but there was fear in it now, a stark contrast to his usual calm demeanor. He gripped Lena's arm tightly, pulling her back, trying to drag her away from the edge of the water. No, Lena breathed, pulling away from him. We can't run anymore. It won't stop. Not until we end it. We have to destroy it. Jacob's face twisted with a mix of disbelief and fear. How? How are we supposed to destroy something like that? Lena's mind raced, searching for anything that might help. The woman had spoken about the land, about the curse that bound the creature to the lake. She'd said it could never truly be destroyed, only delayed. But Lena wasn't ready to accept that. She had to believe there was something, some way to stop it for good. Suddenly, her eyes locked onto the shimmering water. The creature had emerged from the depths, but the lake, the dark water, was still there, still as deadly as ever. She realized that the key to this nightmare had always been the lake. The water wasn't just a home for the creature, it was the source of its power. Jacob, we need to get to the water, Lena said urgently, her voice shaking. He looked at her confused. What are you talking about? It's too dangerous. It's the only way, she insisted. The lake is the key. We have to stop it at its source. Without waiting for Jacob to argue, Lena sprinted toward the water's edge. The creature roared again, its massive claws smashing the ground as it lurched forward, moving faster than she thought possible. It was coming for them, its eyes fixed on Lena, as if it knew she was the threat. Jacob hesitated for only a moment before he followed her, shouting her name, but it was too late. The creature's long, serpentine tail lashed out, sending a blast of dirt and water into the air, knocking Jacob off his feet. He tumbled to the ground, struggling to regain his balance. "Jacob!" Lena screamed, but she couldn't stop now. She had to finish this. With desperate urgency, Lena reached the water's edge, her heart pounding. The lake's surface was still, dark, almost inviting, but she knew better. She knelt down, her fingers trembling as she reached into the cool water. The moment her hand touched the surface, she felt it, a surge of power, a rush of ancient energy coursed through her veins. And for a brief second, it felt as though the lake was alive, pulsing beneath her touch. The creature let out another howl of rage, sensing that something was changing. Lena's mind exploded with images, memories, fragments of knowledge, the curse's origins. She saw the first rituals, the dark magic that bound the creature to the land, to the water. She saw the land's ancient blood flowing through its veins, feeding the curse. And then she saw it, the way to break the bond, to sever the creature from its source. She gasped, her fingers tightening against the water as she focused all her energy on the vision. She needed to act quickly. The creature was almost upon her. "Lena!" Jacob's voice called again, this time closer. He was back on his feet, his face pale but determined. "What are you doing? Get out of there!" But Lena barely heard him. She focused all her willpower on the water. She could feel the energy of the land, of the curse itself, thrumming in her blood, urging her to stop. But she was stronger than that. "By the blood of the earth, by the will of the water, I break this bond," Lena shouted, her voice hoarse with the effort. The ground trembled again, but this time it was different. The earth groaned in protest, and the sky above them darkened. A storm began to form, swirling ominously above the lake. The creature paused, its glowing eyes narrowing as it sensed the shift. It let out a terrible screech, a cry of fury that rattled the trees and shook the very air. It was not used to being challenged. But Lena wasn't backing down. She continued to chant, the words coming from somewhere deep within her. Her voice rose over the creature's growl, louder and more determined. And then, with a final surge of energy, Lena slammed her hand into the water. The world erupted. The force of the surge sent a shockwave rippling across the lake, a burst of energy that splintered the ground around them. The creature screamed in agony, its massive form thrashing violently as the water around it began to churn and bubble. The bond that had tied it to the land, tied it to the lake, was breaking. Lena staggered backward, her breath ragged as the power drained from her. The storm above them swirled in chaotic patterns, lightning flashing across the sky. The very earth seemed to protest as the creature writhed, its form growing smaller, weaker, as if the power that had sustained it for so long was being ripped away. "Lena, we need to get out of here," Jacob shouted, grabbing her arm and pulling her away from the lake's edge. The ground beneath them was cracking, and the air was thick with the scent of burning earth. But Lena couldn't tear her eyes away. She could see it now, the creature's form breaking apart, the dark power that had once held it together unraveling. The storm above them grew fiercer, and for a brief moment, Lena felt a strange peace, as though everything was finally falling into place. And then, with a final, deafening roar, the creature exploded into a blinding flash of light, disintegrating into nothingness. The lake's surface grew still once more, the storm dissipating, leaving an eerie calm behind. Lena fell to her knees, gasping for air. The weight of what had just happened hung heavily in the air. But in the silence that followed, she felt something that had been missing for so long: relief. The curse was over. The creature was gone. The land was free. Jacob crouched beside her, his face pale but filled with relief. "Lena, you did it. We did it." Lena looked at him, a faint smile crossing her lips, though she felt utterly drained. "It's over," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The sun began to rise in the distance, casting a soft, golden light over the land. The lake, once dark and foreboding, now gleamed in the early morning light, its surface calm and peaceful. It was as though the curse had never existed. Lena and Jacob stood together, watching the lake as the first rays of sunlight broke through the trees. They had faced the darkness, and now they had won. It was over.